All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to wander into a very ancient history, a calm excavation of a question that still echoes through time. Who are the Canaanites, and why does their story begin long before any scripture or kingdom ever named them? This journey is not political. It is archaeological, a quiet walk through geology, climate, bones, and the oldest maps carved by rain and stone. Welcome to Sleepless Homo, soft science, slow storytelling, and deep time for tired minds. We're just curious humans, brushing dust from forgotten places, trying to understand how landscapes shaped the people who lived and endured here. Their story ends not in inheritance, but in geology. A reminder that the oldest claim any people have is simply that they lived, and left something worth finding. Now imagine standing above a strip of land so narrow it disappears beneath your thumb on a map, and yet somehow it sits at the hinge of continents, climates, and the long unfolding of human time. Imagine that before villages, before crops, before memory learned how to hold itself in stories, this landscape was already becoming a crossroads, not because anyone chose it, but because the earth itself slowly, quietly insisted on it. To understand why, we have to begin far earlier than any human footstep, in an age when continents drifted like slow thoughts across a restless mantle, and the ground beneath this future land fractured under forces that cared nothing for the lives that would one day rise upon it. What if I told you that the story of this region begins not with culture, but with a fault line? Not with names, but with the cracking of a crust so old it predates the human lineage itself. Long before the earliest phases of the Holocene, long before the first hints of agriculture appeared on its hills, this land was shaped by tectonic forces that stretched from eastern Africa to the northern reaches of the Levant. The Earth's crust here did not merely shift, it opened. It pulled apart like fabric under tension, creating what geologists now call the Great Rift, a scar running thousands of miles, deep enough to hold ancient seas and valleys that would later guide both animals and people in ways no one living at the time could have understood. This rift was not designed for human use, of course. It is simply what happens when plates diverge and magma wells upward, cooling into new formations of basalt and sediment. Yet over geological ages, this movement created an extraordinary series of altitudes. Highlands that trapped clouds, lowlands that held lakes, fault escarpments that funneled winds, and deep basins where ancient waters evaporated into plains of salt. Some of the earliest lakes of this landscape appear in sediments older than any species of human. They formed in warm periods when meltwater flowed from distant mountain ranges, filling depressions carved by the rift's relentless spreading. In colder intervals, these lakes shrank or vanished entirely, leaving behind shorelines etched into stone, which archaeologists now read like the quiet diary of a climate repeatedly shifting between generosity and scarcity, layers of ancient shells, pollen grains preserved by chance, and the thin seams of carbonate crusts allow us to reconstruct environments that changed over tens of thousands of years. The land was never static. It breathed in ice and warmth, shifted in depth and dryness, and through these changes carved natural pathways that later species, including ours, would learn to follow. The coast, too, was shaped by time. During glacial periods, the shoreline extended far outward, as sea levels dropped and exposed plains that no longer exist. When the ice retreated, the sea rose again, drowning ancient beaches and creating new ones. Waves carried sediment inland, pushing sand into long ridges that would one day form coastal dunes rivers, swollen with spring meltwater from far-off mountains, carried silt toward the sea, laying the foundations for future farmland. None of this was intentional, but everything would matter. a land where the coast is wide in one age and narrow in another, becomes a land of shifting opportunities. It offers fertile ground during certain climatic windows and pushes its inhabitants upslope when conditions change. These oscillations laid the groundwork for the ecological diversity that would later define the region. Highlands rose near the fault, their ridges catching moist air blown from the sea. In warm periods, these heights became green, storing rainfall in folded limestone where water filtered into springs. In dry intervals, they remained stable enough to support hardy vegetation that could withstand long seasons without moisture. To early humans, long before the invention of farming or the first permanent dwellings, these hills provided elevated refuge and a vantage point over valleys below. They also marked distinct ecological zones, separated by abrupt changes in altitude. A short walk could take a traveller from open coastal lowlands to steep rocky hills, then down again into the rift's arid basin. It was a compressed world, small in distance but immense in variety. Rainfall patterns too structured this land's story. Mediterranean storms moving eastward shed their moisture over the coastal plain and the western slopes of the hills. Much less fell beyond the heights, leaving the Rift Valley and eastern plateau drier, hotter, and more fragile. These gradients created a patchwork of habitats. Some supported rich plant life, others demanded drought-resistant strategies. The people who would eventually inhabit this terrain could not treat it as a single region. It was divided by the weather itself. Over time, these weather-driven contrasts created natural boundaries, which later societies interpreted as cultural ones, though their origins were entirely environmental. By the early phases of the Holocene, as the world warmed after the last great glacial period, this landscape entered a new stage. Temperate forests reappeared in the highlands, grasslands stretched across the plains, rivers swelled with seasonal flow, carving deeper channels. Some ancient lakes stabilized, while others dried into marshes that supported migrating birds and grazing animals. The diversity of this region was already extraordinary, but now it became even more so. A single day's walk could take a traveller from a humid coastal ecosystem to a semi-arid valley floor. It is little wonder that early foragers, following herds and foraging patches across these environments, found it a land rich in variation and opportunity. Climate records preserved in lake sediments show recurring cycles of wetter and drier phases throughout this early period. During wetter phases, broad river valleys offered stable access to water, attracting animal herds and the people who followed them. In drier intervals, inhabitants turned toward higher elevations where springs persisted. Rather than displacing one another, these changes encouraged movement across a compact but sharply varied landscape. This mobility laid the groundwork for patterns of seasonal movement that would persist for millennia, long before agriculture made permanent settlement more appealing. Rocks along the rift's edges still show signs of ancient shorelines, etched above modern water levels, silent indicators of times when lakes rose during particularly wet centuries. Fossilized pollen in these layers reveals transitions from oak and pistachio woodlands to grasses and shrubs. Each shift hints at climatic pulses that quietly redefined local ecologies and forced early inhabitants to adapt. What we see today as a static map was anything but. For most of prehistory, the land was dynamic, altering itself with slow persistence. And yet, despite all this geological restlessness, the region's small size ensured that its ecosystems never drifted too far apart. The proximity of coast, hills, and deep basin created a natural corridor that channeled both animals and early humans. Herds of gazelles, hartebeests, and onagers moved along these seasonal routes. Early humans, emerging from deeper periods of time, follow them for survival, long before they understood the significance of the path beneath their feet. They moved not toward a destination, but along a pattern shaped by rainfall and topography. In this sense, the land itself became a guide. It provided choices while also limiting them, shaping human presence without requiring human intention. When the first experiments in agriculture took root in the wider region during early Holocene centuries, this strip of land was already marked by its geological contrasts. The highlands offered defensible positions and dependable springs. The coastal lowlands, fed by winter rains, provided fertile soils ready to support early cultivation. The Rift Valley held water sources in some periods and extreme dryness in others, making it both opportunity and challenge. Ancient lakes left nutrient-rich sediments, good for farming but reliant on unpredictable streams. The plateau to the east, shaped by volcanic basalt and scattered springs, held its own small ecological pockets. These contrasts made the region a mosaic, a place where early agricultural communities could test varied strategies within short distances. The earlier settlements in this landscape were not cities but clusters of homes near reliable water. Some stood near highland springs, others near marshy lake margins. Their inhabitants learned to navigate each environment with care. They built homes from stone where forests were thin, from mud brick where clay was plentiful. They moved seasonally when needed and stayed put when climate allowed it. Over time they left behind hearth ash, chipped stone tools, broken pottery, and seeds of early domesticated plants, all of which now help archaeologists reconstruct the early phases of human settling in the region. We know these traces only faintly. Much has been lost. Much remains buried deeper than any trowel can reach. But the broad patterns tell us enough to understand one thing. Humans did not choose this land because it was strategically important. It became strategically important because the land offered such varied ecological possibilities within such compressed space. What is remarkable is how early the region's role as a crossroads emerges from its physical form alone. Even before long-distance trade, even before writing, even before agriculture fully matured, this land served as a narrow connective point between Africa, Asia, and the broader Mediterranean world. Not because early humans knew that they were at an intersection, but because animals moved through here, rainfall guided paths here, and elevation structured safe passage here. The land's narrowness forced movement into specific corridors. Its richness attracted repeated return. Its dangers pushed early communities to invent new strategies for survival. For thousands of years before recorded history, this land trained its inhabitants to adapt, to move, to observe the climate carefully, and to accept that the environment could shift dramatically within a single lifetime. When we speak of this region as an ancient crossroads, we're not referring to caravans or city-states or struggles between later civilizations. We're referring to something older and quieter, the meeting point of wind, water, plate boundaries, and deep time. The crossroads existed before people knew how to walk it, and when people eventually came, they did so because the land's geology had already prepared the path, written in altitudes and rainfall and the deep fractures of the earth. It is humbling to realize that everything to come in this landscape, every culture and settlement and story, rests on this slow geological foundation. The earth shaped the possibilities long before humans shaped the history. And though we can never perfectly reconstruct every ancient lake or shifting shoreline, the evidence we do have allows us to trace the broad arcs of change with enough certainty to recognize the pattern. A small land made enormous by its contrasts, a narrow region made important by its geology, a place where mobility and stability constantly balanced each other across time. In the end, the earliest importance of this land is not measured by the rise of cities or the movement of armies, but by something simpler. It is measured by the way water fell, the way rocks lifted, the way ancient lakes rose and vanished, and the way early humans followed these signals into a landscape that would become far more significant than they could ever have imagined. We do not have all the answers. Much of this story remains embedded in stone and sediment. But what we do know so far suggests that long before any human gave this land a name, the Earth itself was shaping it into a place where many futures would converge. If you feel comfortable, gently tap like or subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because it helps other sleepless thinkers find a calm corner of the internet. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? In bed, drifting off, on a long drive, cooking, studying with headphones. However you join, timestamps are here if your mind wanders, as minds do. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now imagine this. The very first footsteps across this land were not guided by stories, borders, or even intention, but by something far older and quieter, the mood of the climate itself. Imagine a world just beginning to warm after tens of thousands of years of cold, when ice sheets still clung to distant mountains and meltwater carved new paths through stone. Imagine standing at the edge of this warming earth around the early Holocene, watching a landscape reshaped by forces no human could name, yet forces powerful enough to decide where early families slept, walked, hunted, gathered, and survived. What if I told you that before anyone chose this land, the climate chose for them? In the centuries following the last great glacial period, the planet shifted into a gentler rhythm. Temperatures rose across continents. Snow retreated from foothills that had known frost for ages. Winds brought new patterns of rainfall to regions that had been dry for long stretches of time. What had once been a patchwork of glacial deserts and cold steppes slowly transformed into a mosaic of green valleys, marshes, woodlands, and grasslands. The land that would one day host cities and stories was still empty of such things, but it was becoming rich in ecological opportunities. To early human groups moving across the wider Near Eastern landscape, this region did not appear as a place to settle. It appeared as a place where life was finally returning. Rainfall was one of the most decisive forces in this transition. Storm systems sweeping in from the Mediterranean delivered their moisture unevenly, turning some slopes green while leaving nearby basins dry and stark. The pattern was not constant. Some centuries saw generous rains, filling rivers and swelling ancient marshes. Other centuries delivered long, thirsty intervals in which springs diminished and grasslands retreated. Upslope pollen records from lake beds tell these stories more clearly than any human witness. Oak and pistachio woodlands expanded during humid episodes, only to shrink when drought returned. Wetland plants spread in marshy depressions and later gave way to salt-tolerant species as water evaporated. Through all these shifts, early human groups followed the resources they needed: game animals, edible plants, and fresh water. Culture did not define these movements. Climate did. During the earliest phases of the Holocene, ecological niches multiplied. The coastal plain, once pushed far outward during the cold glacial low sea levels, began to stabilize into a band of fertile soil influenced by winter rains. Here, early groups could forage for wild cereals, fruits, nuts, and tubers that reappeared as the climate warmed. Inland, the hills supported clusters of hardy trees whose nuts became valuable seasonal resources. Springs emanating from limestone ridges provided dependable water sources that animals also visited, creating natural gathering points for both prey and hunters. Further east, the Rift Valley's deep basin fluctuated between wet periods with abundant marshland and dry intervals when the land cracked beneath the sun. These contrasts created natural corridors of movement. Some routes were richer during wet ages, others more navigable during dry times. The climate, not intention, charted these invisible pathways. Archaeological evidence from early Holocene campsites suggests that small groups moved across this terrain in patterns that aligned with seasonal abundance. They harvested wild barley when it ripened in the plains. They tracked migrating gazelles up into the hills as heat built in the lower valleys. They ventured toward freshwater sources when drought demanded it. Rather than settling permanently, these groups cycled through landscapes that offered predictability despite constant change. Hearth ashes, stone tools, and animal bones found in temporary shelters and open-air sites record these movements in fragments, never revealing complete biographies, but hinting at annual rhythms shaped by the climate's slow pulse. It is humbling to consider how early humans read the land without knowing the forces behind its cycles. They saw grasslands return without understanding global ocean currents. They witnessed rivers swell without knowing they were fed by distant snowmelt. They learned, not through explanation, but through experience, that some valleys filled with life after certain rains, while others dried without warning. Their knowledge was observational, adaptive, immediate. They made choices within boundaries nature set long before they arrived. As warming continued, new possibilities emerged, zones where wild cereals grew thick enough to tempt early experimentation in harvesting and storing. Archaeologists identify regions within this landscape where stands of wild barley, einkorn, and emmer appeared in dense clusters, thanks to the combination of winter rain and fertile soils left by ancient river systems. These areas became natural attractors. Families returned to them year after year, learning that certain slopes offered predictable yields when the rains came. Over centuries, this repeated return laid the foundation for stable foraging territories, long before agriculture turned these practices into formal cultivation. Stable foraging territories represent a subtle but important shift. Instead of moving constantly across vast distances, some groups began anchoring themselves to zones rich in predictable seasonal resources. These were not yet villages or farms, but they were reliable places to return to. People learned the rhythms of the land intimately. Which months brought berries to the hills, when gazelles moved through certain passes, how long pools lasted in shaded rock basins after rains. This knowledge created a form of proto-residency. It did not require permanent structures. It required memory, observation, and adaptation to climate cycles that were becoming more stable with each passing century. Migration corridors, too, emerged from these patterns. Animals travelled along paths structured by food and water availability. Early humans learned those routes. Some corridors ran north to south, along the Rift Valley during warm, wet periods. Others ran east to west across the hills during cooler times. Climatic oscillations nudged these paths forward or backward, but the overall geometry of movement remained consistent. Archaeological scatterings of tools across these lines confirm that early humans followed predictable tracks, not because they had destinations, but because the climate determined where life concentrated. Around the middle of the early Holocene, roughly between 9,000 and 7,000 years before the present day, more complex adaptations appear. Evidence from plant remains found in grinding stones hints that some groups were processing wild cereals intensively. Not farming yet, but experimenting with ways to make seasonal abundance last longer than the season itself. This kind of innovation arises only when climate provides enough consistency to make planning possible. People do not grind wild grains extensively if rains are too unpredictable. They do so when the land begins to show familiar patterns: wet winters, dry summers, grasses that ripen at similar times year after year. In this sense, climate did not just shape movement. It shaped early thought. It created stability where creativity could flourish, and instability where ingenuity was needed. It taught early groups to observe the land closely, to read cues in vegetation, cloud patterns, and water levels. These observations form the earliest layers of environmental knowledge that would eventually feed into larger cultural systems. But at this early stage, they remained practical, immediate, and humble. The land was both provider and instructor. As the climate settled into its Holocene warmth, ecological zones became more sharply defined. The coastal plains supported dense stands of wild grains. The hills offered nuts and game. The Rift Valley alternated between marshes teeming with life and barren stretches demanding resilience. The plateau to the east provided small oases fed by springs emerging through volcanic basalt. Each zone required different adaptive strategies. Each zone taught early humans something about survival. And because these zones sat so close to one another, early groups could shift strategies quickly, moving from grain foraging to hunting to fishing within short distances. This ecological diversity fostered flexibility long before cultural identity emerged in any recognizable form. What we can say, with the evidence at hand, is that the earlier stories of this land are stories of climate, not people. They are stories of rainfall carving pathways, of warming temperatures inviting life back into valleys, of seasonal rhythms creating opportunity and constraint in equal measure. They are stories of early humans responding to these changes with curiosity and caution, learning how to live in a place where the earth itself dictated the terms of movement. It is easy to imagine ancient people choosing this land because it was important, but the geological and climatic records remind us of a quieter truth. They chose it because it offered water when water was scarce, animals when animals moved, and plants when plants ripened. They chose it because the climate renewed certain landscapes year after year. They chose it because the land offered enough variation to survive bad seasons, and enough stability to plan for good ones. All of this happened long before names were given, long before stories were written, and long before the landscape would become a cultural intersection, recognized across later ages. We still do not have all the answers. Much of what we know about early Holocene movement comes from small clusters of tools, plant impressions, animal bones, and climate data extracted from lakebed sediments and caves. These are fragments, not full narratives, but taken together, they reveal a land whose earliest human importance emerged from climate's hand, gently but persistently shaping every decision. The footsteps that passed through here were drawn not by ambition or direction, but by the quiet logic of rainfall, temperature, and the timeless search for life in a changing world. A family in the early Neolithic stands at the edge of a fertile plain, its soil dark, soft and promising. Below them lie the richest patches of earth they have ever seen, full of potential harvest they could one day gather, and yet, instead of settling where grain grows easiest, they turn away from the lowlands and begin walking uphill. They climb toward limestone ridges, toward slopes where stones jut from the earth, toward landscapes that demand more effort to build upon and more patience to tame. Why would anyone choose the heights over the plains? Why build homes among rock when abundance waited below? To answer that, we must enter a world where early farming was fragile, vulnerable, and deeply dependent on choices made not for comfort, but for survival. As the early Holocene warmth settled over this landscape between roughly 7,000 and 4,000 years before the present day, farming was no longer an experiment, it was becoming a way of life. Wild cereals that had once been gathered seasonally were now sown intentionally. Goats and sheep that had once been hunted were now tethered to human schedules. People were no longer following food across the land. They were learning to make food stay with them. But domestication brought a new challenge: permanence. A family that relies on crops needs security, and security is shaped by more than soil quality. It is shaped by water, by safety, by visibility, and by the ability to control the land immediately around a home. The highlands offered something the plains could not. They offered predictability where floods could not reach. They offered vantage points over the surrounding landscape, and they offered bedrock that could hold water long after the rains had stopped. Limestone hills, cracked through by natural fractures, collected winter rains in cavities and fissures. Springs emerged from these rocks at consistent points, sometimes flowing even in dry seasons. To an early community, a spring was more valuable than the richest soil. It was the promise that life would continue through the dry months. This alone explains part of the uphill choice. Fertile plains could be farmed, but hills could be lived in early Neolithic settlements. Across this region reveal clusters of stone-built homes perched on slopes and ridges. Archaeologists studying these structures note that the floors often sit carefully cut into the hillside itself. Instead of flattening the land through major excavation, early builders shaped their homes to the contours of the earth. A house might have one side built directly against a natural rock outcrop, which served as a wall. Another side might use stacked stones gathered from nearby terraces. The choice of stone was practical. Timber was limited in many highland zones. Stone, on the other hand, was abundant and durable. When families added roofing made of brushwood, reeds, and packed earth, the result was a home stable enough to endure heavy rains yet cool under the summer sun. Terracing emerged in these centuries as one of the region's quiet revolutions. Farmers carved narrow platforms into slopes, carrying away loose stones and arranging them into low retaining walls. These early terraces prevented soil from sliding downhill during winter storms. They allowed water to absorb slowly into the earth, rather than rush down the slopes in torrents. Terraces turned steep hillsides into productive farmland, even if the yield was smaller than that of the plains. But smaller yields in a stable landscape were often worth more than larger yields in a flood-prone one. It is difficult to survive a failure in the plains. Floods can destroy entire fields in a single day. But hillside terraces, shaped to hold soil and channel water gently downward, created resilience. Over centuries, these terraces multiplied, forming stair-like landscapes still visible in some regions today. Water storage also defined Neolithic life on the hills. Cisterns carved into limestone began appearing as early innovations. These underground chambers were plastered with early lime-based mixtures that reduced leakage. During winter rains, channels carried water into these cisterns. During summer dryness, people could draw from them when streams and springs waned. The reliability of these systems cannot be overstated. A secure water supply allowed early communities to survive multi-season droughts, something the plains could not guarantee. This may be the clearest answer to our opening question. Early farmers built homes on heights, not because they ignored the plains, but because they understood the need to survive beyond a single bountiful season. As early farming communities grew, their homes gradually clustered. A few houses became a small neighbourhood. A small neighbourhood became a village. Villages spread along ridges and hilltops, each anchored to its local spring or cistern. Archaeologists find these clusters across the highlands, often arranged in loose, circular layouts. Central spaces sometimes appear, likely used for shared activities such as grain processing, pottery firing, and gatherings. Grinding stones placed in communal areas reveal that grain, though grown on terraced slopes, was often processed collectively. it seems early communities valued shared labour, especially during the demanding work of grinding cereals by hand. If a single family attempted this task alone, it could take hours. As a group, the work became faster and more social. Stone tools from these village sites tell a story of increasing specialisation. Blades shaped from flint or chert were used to harvest cereals. Polished stone axes were used to clear brush or shape wood. Small scrapers served in hide preparation pottery, introduced widely during this era, transformed the way communities stored food. Before pottery, storage was limited to baskets or pits lined with organic materials. With durable ceramic vessels, families could keep grain dry during the winter and carry water from springs to homes without constant leakage. Pottery also enabled cooking methods that softened grains into stews and porridges, making them easier to digest, and nutritionally richer animal bones found in hillside settlements reveal that domestication had advanced significantly by this time. Goats and sheep, hardy animals able to navigate steep terrain, proved ideal for highland living. They grazed on shrubs and grasses unsuitable for agriculture, converting otherwise unusable vegetation into milk, meat and hides. Their manure enriched terraced fields. Their predictable breeding cycles supported long-term planning. Yet these animals needed shepherding. Villagers placed themselves in heights not only for water but for oversight. From a ridge, a shepherd could scan the surrounding slopes and guide flocks safely, keeping them away from predators and into the best grazing patches. In the lowlands, wild animals moved freely across open plains, which made them hard to manage. In the hills, terrain naturally guided their movement. Early shepherds learned how to use the land shape as a tool. Gullies and ridges became natural corridors. Narrow passes served as checkpoints. With time, simple stone enclosures were built to house animals overnight, protecting them from wolves or big cats that roamed the region. These enclosures appear in excavations as circular or semicircular pens adjacent to homes or slightly downhill from villages, positioned near terraces where crops grew. What is striking about this period is how early communities began to blend household survival with community-scale organisation. Terraces required cooperative effort to maintain. Cisterns demanded coordination to clean and repair. Shared grinding stones encouraged daily interaction. Nearby fields benefited from communal watchfulness. This was not yet a highly stratified society, but it was a society learning how to live in place, rather than following herds or seasonal plants across long distances. By living on heights, these early villagers gained something else: protection from sudden flooding. Lowland plains, as fertile as they were, could become dangerous during heavy winter storms. Rivers swollen by rainfall and meltwater carved new channels unpredictably. Floods could ruin stored grain, flatten temporary dwellings, and leave debris across fields. Highland communities, perched above these floodplains, watched the storms from safety. Their terraces absorbed heavy rainfall gradually, preventing soil erosion. Their cisterns captured excess water for later use. Their homes, anchored into rock, resisted collapse. These strategies shaped the Neolithic landscape into one of remarkable human resilience. Even today, archaeologists studying early terracing and water management marvel at the ingenuity required to transform hillsides into sustainable farmland. Every terrace wall represents countless stones carried and placed by hand. Every cistern reflects experimentation with plaster mixtures and water flow. Every village cluster shows the delicate balance of individual homes and cooperative labour. It is one of the earliest examples we know of a society building its environment deliberately, shaping the land to serve both the present and the future. One of the most intriguing aspects of early highland settlements is their subtlety. They were rarely monumental. They did not leave behind towering structures. What remains today are small outlines of walls, fragments of pottery, grinding stones worn smooth by years of use, and the faint signatures of terraces still visible under modern vegetation. These traces suggest a quiet life of routine, observation, and steady effort. Yet these small places form the cradle of many later agricultural traditions. The skills learned here in these centuries of experimentation would ripple outward over time. By the later part of this time frame, between roughly 5,000 and 4,000 years before the present day, settlements in the hills became slightly larger and more complex. Houses gained additional rooms, storage areas expanded, pottery styles diversified. Some sites show early signs of planned layout, with paths between homes and communal working spaces. These developments hint at slow population growth and increasing stability. But they also show how the land itself continued to shape decisions. Villages did not spread randomly. They appeared near springs, on ridges with defensible access points, or beside terraced slopes that could support crops through several cycles of drought and rain. If we step back and observe the broad arc of these centuries, a pattern emerges. Early farming communities did not choose the highlands because they rejected the plains. They chose the heights because the land, the water, and the climate made those places more reliable over long periods. They shaped the hillsides because the hills offered a balance of security, visibility, and stable water that the lowlands could not match year after year. They built in stone because stone was abundant. They clustered in villages because cooperation became essential to maintaining their way of life. From this slow, steady transformation of the landscape came the earliest roots of settled life in this region. We still do not know everything about why certain villages thrived while others were abandoned. We cannot always reconstruct the specific choices behind a terrace or a cistern. But what we do know so far reveals a people learning to read the land with extraordinary skill, shaped by its rhythms and responding with ingenuity to its challenges. These hills, once seen as rugged barriers, became home because they offered something invaluable: continuity. A family could plant, harvest, store, and survive here through cycles of good years and bad. And in those cycles, they found a stability far more important than the fertile soils below. Imagine this. You're standing on a rise above a landscape that has known only villages for thousands of years. Small clusters of stone houses, terraced fields, shepherd paths, and quiet springs have shaped human life since the first farmers settled the hills. But now, in the early centuries of the Bronze Age, something begins to change in the lowlands and on certain ridges. The outlines of settlements grow thicker, walls rise higher, open spaces take on new meaning, pathways turn into streets, storage pits multiply. And at some point between roughly 3,300 and 2,400 years before the present day, the question quietly emerges: when does a settlement stop being a village and become a city? To understand that transition, we must first imagine these early communities not as bustling centres of power, but as experiments in scale, each shaped by its environment in ways that would eventually give rise to urban life. The earliest signs of this transformation appear at sites built atop what archaeologists call tells, the layered mounds that form when generations of habitation accumulate in the same place. A tell is not merely a hill, it is time made visible. Beneath each layer lies the ash of ancient hearths, the floors of old houses, broken pots left behind by families long gone, and walls rebuilt again and again as needs changed. By the beginning of the Bronze Age, some of these tells had grown large enough and complex enough that they could no longer be called villages in any simple sense. What triggered this change was not a single invention or discovery, but a convergence of pressures and opportunities. The land between the Mediterranean coast and the inland highlands was becoming increasingly connected through trade and movement. Metallurgy, once limited to small-scale crafting, began to expand. Early copper objects appeared more frequently. Long-distance materials like obsidian, bitumen, and exotic shells reached these settlements. When a community became a node in such a network, its internal structure had to adapt. Storage needed to increase. Spaces for artisans needed to expand. Areas for exchange and meeting had to be organized. And with all of this came a subtle but important shift: the need to manage people, goods, and knowledge more carefully. One of the first visible signs of urban development is fortification. Not the grand walls of later ages, but practical, functional enclosures of stone and mud brick that serve to mark boundaries and guide movement. These early walls often encircled the entire settlement, rising in places where the slope of the tell offered natural defence. They were not always built to repel invaders. Sometimes they served as flood barriers. Sometimes they enclosed administrative or ceremonial spaces. Sometimes they regulated access to storage areas. In either case, their presence reveals a growing sense of communal identity and the need to structure life within a shared space. Alongside these walls emerged public architecture. Archaeologists have uncovered broad rooms with thick walls, sometimes interpreted as early administrative buildings. In them, they find large storage vessels capable of holding grain or oil, platforms that may have served as work surfaces, and partitions that suggest different functions within the same structure. These buildings were unlike the smaller domestic homes that clustered nearby. Their scale alone hints at coordination, planning, and shared labour. To build walls this thick, people had to cooperate on a level that surpassed household needs. Public architecture marks a community thinking beyond the family. It marks the emergence of something that looks increasingly like governance, even if we cannot yet define its form. Another hallmark of early cities is specialization. In earlier centuries, individual households produced most of what they needed. But in the Bronze Age, certain areas of settlements become associated with particular crafts. Archaeologists find clusters of flint tools in one area, pottery kilns in another, metalworking debris in a third. Specialized zones appear, suggesting that some individuals or families focused on particular skills and exchanged their work with others. This specialization strengthened the ties between households. It also required stable, predictable systems of distribution. Such systems, however informal, helped push these communities toward more complex and centralized forms of organization. Differences between lowland and highland development become most pronounced during this era. Lowland settlements near fertile valleys or along major trade pathways tended to grow larger and develop urban features sooner. Their access to abundant crops and to caravan routes encouraged the accumulation of goods and the construction of storage facilities. Highland settlements, though still active and vibrant, often remained smaller, shaped by their rugged terrain and limited agricultural surplus. However, some highland sites developed unique forms of community organisation, such as extensive terracing or stone structures built across ridges. These communities were not urban in the classical sense, but they contributed to the larger network of exchange and communication across the region. Trade outposts also appear during this early urban period. Small, strategically placed sites located near water sources or along natural corridors served as resting points for traders moving between coastal plains, valley floors, and upland regions. Excavations reveal that these outposts held pottery from distant places, fragments of metal tools and objects not locally produced. Their existence shows that early cities were not isolated. They formed part of a broader system of movement and exchange stretching across the Near East. To be a city was to be connected. And connection brought more than goods. It brought ideas, techniques, and social complexity. Perhaps the clearest threshold marking the emergence of early cities is the appearance of administrative practices. These do not always show up in the form of writing. Instead, we see seal impressions on clay, used to mark containers or control storage. Seals suggest oversight, accountability, and a system of tracking goods within or between settlements. In some locations, archaeologists have found small clay tokens that may represent units of trade or inventory. These tokens appeared long before true writing systems existed in the region, yet they reveal the need to manage increasingly complex economic activity. When people begin marking their goods, labelling their storage jars, or tracking quantities, they're participating in the earliest forms of bureaucracy. As these administrative practices developed, so did the divergence between domestic and public spaces. Homes remained modest in size, often arranged around courtyards or narrow lanes. But public areas expanded. Open spaces in front of large buildings may have served as gathering places. Some settlements show early signs of planned street layouts, with pathways wide enough to guide pack animals or small wagons. These streets were rarely straight. Instead, they followed the contours of the tell or responded to the needs of communal movement. But their consistent presence indicates awareness of traffic and the need to manage the flow of daily life. Food production also transformed. Large storage vessels indicate that surplus grain was being collected and redistributed. Early irrigation techniques developed in areas near perennial streams allowed farmers to extend cultivation beyond rain-fed fields. This increased agricultural output supported larger populations, which in turn required more storage space and more coordinated labour. Food, once gathered or grown for household use, became part of a broader network of exchange. Some areas even show evidence of centralised processing, such as communal grinding areas or large hearths used for preparing food for many people. These practices helped stabilise supply during lean years, making urban life possible in a land frequently subjected to climatic fluctuations. One of the most striking developments in early Bronze Age cities is the use of monumental architecture as a form of social expression. Not monuments in the sense of grand religious buildings or palaces, but structures designed to impress through scale and effort. Massive platforms built from mud brick or stone, extensive fortification systems, and large public buildings required cooperation on a level unseen in earlier periods. They served not only functional purposes but symbolic ones. A community capable of building such structures was demonstrating its unity, its technological skill, and its ability to plan for the long term. These structures stood for generations, anchoring identity in place. The question of when a settlement becomes a city does not have a single answer. It emerges from a combination of scale, organisation, specialisation, and vision. A city begins when a community builds for more than its present needs. It begins when people work together on projects whose benefits extend beyond immediate survival. It begins when food, goods, labour, and knowledge flow in ways that create interdependence. It begins when households recognise themselves as part of something larger, something that sits at the centre of both daily life and regional networks. By the end of this early Bronze Age window, some settlements in this region had unmistakably crossed that threshold. They were no longer simply clusters of houses. They were centres of exchange, cooperation, planning and memory. They produced goods for trade. They stored surplus food. They built walls and public structures. They used seals and tokens to track their resources. They maintained connections with distant lands, and they shaped themselves through shared labour and shared intention. These early cities would evolve, collapse, and rise again in different forms over later centuries. But their earliest appearance marks a profound shift in how human communities imagined their place in the world. We do not know every detail of this transformation. Archaeology offers fragments, and from those fragments we build our best interpretations. We cannot always tell who made the decisions behind these walls, or how disagreements were resolved. But the evidence we do have shows communities reshaping themselves to meet the challenges of growing populations, expanding trade, and increasing social complexity. They responded creatively, thoughtfully, and often with remarkable resilience. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the urban traditions that would follow across the ages. Imagine this. A traveller in the early 3rd millennium before the present day walks only a few days in any direction, yet finds themselves in what feels like an entirely different world. The air shifts, the soil changes colour beneath their feet, the plants they recognise disappear and are replaced by others suited to harsher or wetter ground. The scent of the wind changes, carrying sea salt in one place, dust in another, and cool mountain air only a short climb away. What if I told you that the land we often imagine as one continuous region was, in truth, 4 ancient worlds stitched together by valleys, ridges, climate, and stone? To understand the archaeology of this land between the seas and the desert, we must first understand its divisions, not political, not cultural, not drawn by any early hand. The divisions the earliest inhabitants encountered were carved by geology and weather, a coastal plain running like a soft ribbon along the sea, a rugged line of hills rising behind it, a deep rift that sliced through the earth like a wound, and a vast plateau stretching beyond that rift toward even drier lands. Each zone created different possibilities for life, and each shaped the people who lived there in subtle, measurable ways long before any later identities formed. The coastal plain was the first of these worlds. Flat, fertile, and open to winter rains blown inland from the Mediterranean, it was a landscape shaped by abundance and risk. The soils here were deep and forgiving, nourished by river deposits and marine sediments washed ashore during earlier geological ages. Streams flowed across the plain in cooler months, filling shallow basins and temporary wetlands that bloomed with life. Wild grains thrived here. Herd animals followed predictable routes. Communities living on the edges of this plain had access to fish, marsh plants, migratory birds, and crops in quantities impossible in the interior, yet the plain was also exposed. Floods swept through with little warning. Storms arrived directly from the sea, and its openness meant that movement across it was easy not only for traders, but also for those who might threaten its inhabitants. The archaeological record here shows large settlements appearing early, shaped by agricultural opportunity and by the need to navigate a landscape where nothing, neither wealth nor safety, was ever fully secure. Just inland, the world changed. The hills rose sharply, forming the highland zone that would define so much of the region's human story. These hills were rugged, built of limestone that fractured into narrow valleys and steep ridges. Their soils were thin but rich in minerals. Rainfall was higher than in the plains, especially on western slopes exposed to Mediterranean moisture. Springs emerged from underground channels, providing dependable water even during dry seasons. Life here demanded effort. Farming required terracing. Water required storage or long walks. Paths twisted along ridges instead of cutting straight across the land. But the hills offered something priceless: defensibility. Anyone who lived among these heights could see far into the lowlands. Approaches were narrow and steep. Communities could anchor themselves to stone, building clustered homes that took shelter from wind and cold. Archaeologically, the highlands show signs of early village permanence, of terraced landscapes carefully maintained generation after generation, and of a rhythm of life shaped by the land's narrowness and protection. If the highlands were a world of heights and stone, then the Rift Valley lying to their east was a world of extremes. This vast geological scar, part of a system stretching far beyond this region, dropped dramatically far below the surrounding terrain. Within it lay lakes, marshes and desert zones in close proximity. Rainfall barely reached the rift in many eras, leaving much of it dry and salt-streaked. Yet certain areas, especially in the northern stretches, held freshwater sources that supported lush pockets of vegetation and rich hunting grounds. Archaeologists find some of the oldest settlements near these waters. The contrast between the fertile pockets and the barren expanses gave rise to lifeways based on mobility, opportunism, and acute environmental knowledge. To live in the Rift Valley required understanding its shifting boundaries, where water pooled after rain, where vegetation receded during droughts, and how to navigate a landscape that changed from nurturing to unforgiving in just a day's walk. This world shaped a people accustomed to adaptation. Beyond the rift lay the fourth world, the Transjordan Plateau. High, windswept, and vast, it stretched into lands that became increasingly arid. With each step eastward, rainfall decreased sharply. Soils were dominated by basalt or compacted sediments. Vegetation clustered around seasonal streams fed by distant springs. Winters could be biting, summers could be severe. Life here encouraged semi-nomadic patterns, as grazing animals needed to move across wide areas to find enough food. Permanent settlements existed, but they were carefully placed where water could be stored or channeled. Archaeologically, this plateau reveals strategies built around resilience: stone enclosures for herds, small seasonal dwellings, and limited but important agricultural patches cultivated only where nature allowed. While the western regions grew denser populations over time, the plateau remained a land where mobility was as important as permanence. These four worlds, coastal plain, hill country, rift valley and plateau, were close enough to influence one another, yet distinct enough to shape different ways of living. The coastal plain encouraged trade and agriculture, but demanded caution against floods. The hills encouraged permanence and cooperation, but demanded labour to tame the slopes. The Rift Valley encouraged mobility and environmental adaptation, but demanded awareness of its harsh boundaries. The plateau encouraged pastoralism and seasonal movement, but demanded strategies to survive scarcity. When archaeologists study pottery styles, settlement patterns, burial types, or architectural features from this era, they can often identify the ecological signature of each world, not because people thought of themselves as separate, but because the land itself guided their choices. Rainfall played one of the most decisive roles in shaping these differences. The western zones received winter storms that brought enough water to support grain cultivation, orchards, and grazing animals. The hills caught even more rain as clouds rose and cooled along the slopes. But beyond the rift, rainfall dropped so sharply that only drought-resistant plants thrived. This difference in water availability influenced every aspect of life. On the coast and in the hills, communities could rely on seasonal predictability to plant crops and store surpluses. In the rift and on the plateau, people relied more heavily on herding, hunting, and opportunistic farming wherever moisture collected. Altitude also shaped patterns. The hills provided cooler temperatures, reducing disease risk and allowing crops such as early figs and olives to thrive in sheltered pockets. The Rift Valley, by contrast, experienced intense heat, long dry seasons, and dramatic swings between fertile and barren conditions. These contrasts created distinct seasonal strategies, Highland communities might store grain for lean months. Rift Valley communities might follow animal migrations or exploit marsh resources that flourished only after rains. Plateau groups might move flocks along elevation gradients, seeking grasses where they still grew. Soil types added another layer. Coastal alluvium supported broad fields of cereals. Hilltop limestone soils were thin and rocky, but highly responsive to terracing. Rift Valley soils range from salty crusts in the south to rich black earth in damper zones of the north. Plateau soils were patchy and often mineral-heavy, useful for grazing but challenging for intensive agriculture. Archaeological surveys reveal that the density of ancient settlements correlates closely with soil profiles, confirming how deeply the land dictated human presence. Defensibility further divided these worlds. The coastal plain, open and exposed, required size and numbers for protection. The hills offered natural barriers, allowing small communities to hold their ground. The Rift Valley, depending on its location, could be either impenetrable due to steep cliffs or vulnerable due to open basins. The plateau, meanwhile, gave wide visibility but limited cover, shaping strategies based on movement rather than fortification. Early defensive structures reflect these realities. In the hills, stone enclosures hugged ridges. On the plain, walls enclosed larger areas. On the plateau, evidence of fortification is rarer, replaced by signs of mobility and adaptability. Across these four ancient worlds, we see the earliest foundations of what archaeology later associates with the cultural mosaic of this region. Not names, not nations, not later stories, but patterns. The coastal plain's openness to trade, the hill country's insistence on cooperation, the Rift Valley's blend of opportunity and harshness, and the plateau's long memory of movement. These were not divisions made by humans. They were divisions made by land, rainfall, rock, wind, and the quiet logic of survival. When we look back across these millennia, it is tempting to see unity where none existed, or fragmentation where the land simply encouraged difference. But the truth is quieter. Small groups carved lives in landscapes that asked different things from them. Coastal communities learned to navigate abundance and vulnerability. Highland communities learned to sculpt the earth and share water. Rift Valley groups learned to read nature's swift changes. Plateau groups learned to move with the seasons. Together, these diverse strategies form the earliest distinctive layers of life in the land between seas and desert. We cannot claim to know every detail. The archaeological record, rich as it is, remains incomplete. But the patterns we do see reveal a land whose natural divisions shaped its earliest identities, not through boundaries or myths, but through the intimate relationship between humans and environment. And in those relationships, the foundations of an ancient world took form, defined not by who lived where, but by how the land itself spoke to them. You're standing on a high ridge in the late 3rd millennium before the present day, long before script began to record belief. The wind moves through the stones. A circle of ash lies cold on the ground. A row of upright pillars cast long shadows across the dust. No names have yet been carved into clay. No myths have been written to anchor memory. Yet someone has arranged these stones with intention. Someone has placed offerings here. Someone has gathered their community around a fire and spoken words that will never reach us. What do you believe when no written myth exists yet? How do you speak to the unseen when your only language is gesture, stone, fire, and earth? Archaeology gives us only quiet clues, and in many ways these clues are more intimate than any later text. Across the landscape of the early 2nd millennium before the present day, we find standing stones set upright in deliberate alignment. Some appear alone, a solitary pillar fixed into bedrock. Others stand in groups, forming small sanctuaries open to the sky. Their surfaces hold no inscriptions. Their shapes vary from rough monoliths to carefully worked stones with smoothed faces. But the intention behind them is unmistakable. These were not foundations for buildings. They were not markers of property. They were focal points, gathering places for gestures of reverence, offerings, or remembrance. In the absence of writing, stone became the earliest medium for expressing belief. Open-air sanctuaries provide another window into the spiritual life of early Canaan in this era. These spaces were often placed on elevated points overlooking settlements or valleys. Archaeologists find platforms of packed earth or stone, sometimes with shallow basins carved into them. Ash layers indicate repeated burning, likely connected to ritual activity. In viscera sites, animal bones show patterns of selective deposition, distinct from domestic waste. These bones are sorted by type, sometimes cleaned or intentionally broken, suggesting that people engaged in specific ritual acts that followed traditions we can only partially reconstruct. The landscape itself, not enclosed rooms, served as the temple. The horizon, not a roof, framed the sacred. It is tempting to imagine that early religion here centered around a single set of ideas, but the evidence suggests a mosaic of practices shaped by household needs, local ecology, and shared memory. Pottery from this period begins to display symbols that appear to carry meaning beyond function. Certain jar forms are decorated with repeating motifs, spirals, geometric lines, stylized plants, or animals. While we cannot decode these symbols as writing, their repetition hints at shared ideas. Some vessels used in domestic contexts show signs of burning only on their rims, suggesting they played a role in pouring offerings into fire or onto altars. The symbolism of these vessels is subtle, but it shows that belief was woven into daily routines, not restricted to special places. Even household architecture reveals traces of ritual. In many homes, archaeologists find small niches carved into walls, sometimes containing figurines or miniature vessels. These items differ from ordinary utensils. They're often too small to serve practical purposes. Their placement in corners or near hearths suggests offering spaces that watched over domestic life. The hearth itself, where food was cooked and warmth was kept, often doubled as a focal point of household ritual. There is evidence that ashes from the hearth were sometimes cleaned and preserved deliberately, perhaps linked to renewal or protection rituals. In this sense, religion did not live only in high places or stone circles. It lived beside the fire where families prepared their meals. One of the most evocative forms of early ritual evidence is the stone altar. Some are simple slabs set horizontally on smaller stones. Others are built as small towers of unworked rock. Many bear discoloration from repeated exposure to flame. A few show shallow depressions that may have held liquids for libations. These altars appear not only in public sanctuaries but also in fields and beside springs. Their presence near agricultural terraces suggests rites linked to planting or harvest. Their placement near springs suggests rituals of water, fertility, or gratitude. Without inscriptions, we cannot claim certainty, but patterns of use, seasonal deposition of plant remains, and stratigraphy reveal a cyclical rhythm of offerings tied to the necessities of life: food, water, renewal, and protection. Figurines found in early Bronze Age contexts offer intriguing yet ambiguous insights. Many are abstract, with minimal facial features or simplified body shapes. Some appear to emphasize fertility, others authority, others a posture of offering. Their diversity suggests that no single icon dominated belief. Instead, households or communities may have held their own traditions, shaped by memory and local customs. Some figurines were found intentionally buried under thresholds, possibly to guard a home or mark a new beginning. Others appear broken and scattered, perhaps as part of ritual termination. These gestures reveal belief not through doctrine, but through the careful handling of symbolic objects. Another layer of early Canaanite religion appears in the organization of burial practices. Although mortuary traditions varied between communities, many show a deliberate attempt to connect the living, and the dead burials might be placed beneath house floors or in caves near settlements. Grave goods include beads, tools, and simple pottery. Some burials show signs that bodies were repositioned or revisited, hinting at ongoing relationships with ancestors. Ritual continuity mattered more than monumentality. The dead were integrated into the household or village landscape, creating a spiritual geography that blended daily life with remembrance. Animal remains in ritual context also provide clues. In certain sanctuaries, bones from particular species, often goats or sheep, appear more frequently than others. Cut marks and burn patterns suggest that parts of the animals were consumed while others were offered. This selective deposition reflects early foundations of ritual sacrifice, not as large ceremonial events but as modest, repeated acts embedded in community life. The presence of offering bowls nearby, often decorated with geometric patterns, reinforces the idea that liquid offerings accompanied these practices, poured onto altars or into fire pits. Across the region, archaeologists also identify standing stones arranged in pairs or lines that seem to reference celestial events. In some sites, their alignments match solstice sunrises or seasonal star positions. While we cannot be certain that these alignments were intentional, their repetition across multiple settlements suggests knowledge of the sky played a role in marking time or conducting rituals. Skywatching was not a luxury. For early agricultural communities, knowing the rhythm of seasons was crucial. Observing the horizon became a spiritual act as much as a practical one. Environmental features shaped belief as well. Springs were often treated as sacred places. Pools formed by winter rains, though temporary, sometimes held small offerings. Certain rock formations show petroglyphs carved into their surfaces, lines, circles, or animal shapes. Though the meanings remain elusive, their placement near high vantage points or along ancient paths indicates that people paused here not simply to rest, but to acknowledge something meaningful. Such carvings, humble as they are, form some of the earliest marks of symbolic expression in this region during this period. The absence of writing does not imply the absence of complex religious ideas. It simply means that belief was expressed through material acts that leave only indirect traces. A row of stones tells us nothing of the words once spoken around it. A broken figurine cannot reveal the stories told when it was placed in a niche. A fire pit filled with ash layers cannot describe the emotions that accompanied each offering. But these fragments, taken together, suggest a world view built around cycles, transitions, and relationships, with forces understood not through text but through nature. What is striking about this early belief system is how deeply it was rooted in the environment. Rituals grew from the needs of daily life: rain, harvest, fertility, protection, and remembrance. The earliest sanctuaries were not hidden away. They were placed where the land itself felt significant, on ridges, near springs, by fields, or under open skies. Religion was not separate from survival. It was woven through it. To farm was to hope. To store grain was to trust. To build a home was to ask for protection. Spirituality lived in these acts long before any myths were carved or recorded. We still know very little. Archaeology offers glimpses, not complete visions. Yet what we know so far suggests that early Canaanite religion, long before writing, was built on quiet gestures, lifting a stone, lighting a fire, placing a vessel in a niche, burying a figurine beneath a threshold, offering the first portion of grain to the land. These acts reveal a humanity familiar to us even across millennia. They remind us that belief often begins not with names or doctrine, but with small repeated gestures shaped by the world around us, and by the desire to make meaning in a landscape both generous and unpredictable. Imagine this. You climb a hill at dusk in the early second millennium before the present day. The air cools, dust settles, and the last light of the sun catches something enormous on the skyline. A wall so thick, so high, and so carefully built that it makes the houses below it look like toys left by children. You pause, not because of a famous name or a known king, but because of the sheer ambition held in mud, brick and stone. What if I told you that the Middle Bronze Age left behind fortifications so massive, so deliberate, that they outlived the memory of the people who built them? That for centuries scholars would ask, who needed walls this big, long before any text explained why? To walk into this era archaeologically is to enter a landscape of power without biography. Cities expanded in size. Their walls thickened into monumental ramparts. Gate systems grew complex, twisting attackers into kill zones. And behind those defences lay societies reorganising themselves into multi-tiered settlements, each with a hierarchy of authority that left marks in architecture, but not always in writing. The Middle Bronze Age, roughly between 2000 and 1600 years before the present day, reshaped this land into a web of fortified centres whose names are mostly lost, but whose designs still stand as evidence of political ambition. The rise of advanced fortification systems is one of the clearest markers of this transformation. Earlier defences were practical and modest, but in this period, cities wrapped themselves in engineering feats rarely seen in earlier centuries. Archaeologists uncover enormous glacis systems, sloped embankments made of packed earth, covered with limestone plaster, angled so steeply that climbing them in battle would have been nearly impossible. Above these glacis rose towering walls of mud brick, often reinforced with wooden beams and inner chambers packed with fill. The walls were not only barriers, they were statements, architectural declarations of the city's strength and the authority of whoever ruled it. Gate complexes became increasingly sophisticated. Instead of simple passages, cities constructed multi-room entryways where each turn slowed an intruder. Some gateways included chambers that may have been used for guards, storage, or administrative checks. Others had paved roads leading inward, channels for drainage, and high towers overlooking the approach. These gates were engineered with a level of care that reveals a deep understanding of both warfare and ceremony. Passing through one was entering both a defensive structure and a public stage. Inside the walls, settlements reorganized into clear tiers. At the top sat major centres with fortifications, public buildings, storage facilities, and specialised quarters for artisans around them lay smaller towns that depended on the larger centres for trade and protection. Still farther out were rural villages tied to the regional power structures by tribute, seasonal trade, or obligations of labour. This hierarchy, though largely invisible in text for this earlier period, becomes obvious when we follow pottery styles, architectural layouts, and patterns of imported goods. Some cities controlled access to metal, especially bronze tools and weapons. Others controlled trade routes, benefiting from their placement near river valleys or coastal corridors. Still others anchored agricultural production, drawing grain and livestock from surrounding villages into centralised storage. One of the most striking archaeological signatures of this age is the scale of public granaries' large silos, sometimes capable of holding several seasons' worth of grain, appear within fortified centres. Their capacity far exceeded the needs of individual households. This suggests coordinated food management, possibly to support soldiers, labourers, or long-term planning during uncertain years. Surplus storage also indicates the rise of elites, groups able to direct labour beyond immediate family needs. The Middle Bronze Age is also the moment when chariot warfare emerges in this region. We do not find chariots intact, but we find the clues they leave behind. Horse remains with specific wear patterns, lightweight wheel designs, and distinctive metal fittings that match chariot constructions known from neighbouring areas. The appearance of chariots marks a shift in military organisation. They required trained horses, skilled drivers, and coordinated tactics. They also required wealth, since maintaining a chariot team was expensive. Their presence hints at rulers who needed to project power beyond city walls, not merely defend them. Archaeologists infer the existence of early alliances from the distribution of standardized pottery, shared architectural features, and coordinated construction phases across multiple sites. When several cities rebuild their fortifications in similar ways within a few generations, it suggests communication or mutual influence. Some hilltop settlements show evidence of synchronized destruction and rebuilding phases, hinting at conflicts whose details are long erased, but whose impacts remain visible in scorched layers and abandoned quarters. Despite the violence implied in these layers, the broader pattern shows increasing connectivity, cities traded goods, shared stylistic trends, and possibly negotiated through envoys whose presence is suggested only by imported materials. The material culture of this era becomes richer and more varied. Pottery styles become more refined, with burnished surfaces and intricate geometric designs. Metalworking flourishes. Bronze daggers, axes, spearheads, and jewellery appear in greater numbers, indicating both rising craftsmanship and wider access to materials like tin and copper. Some settlements show neighbourhoods dedicated to specific crafts, metalworking, weaving, or pottery production. These craft areas are often located near city walls or gate complexes, suggesting careful management of fire, smoke, and trade. Burial practices shift dramatically during this period. Instead of simple graves under houses or in village peripheries, many communities create elaborate tombs carved into bedrock or built from large stones. These tombs often contain multiple individuals, possibly representing family groups maintained over generations. Grave goods vary widely. Some tombs contain metal weapons, jewellery, and imported vessels, while others hold only simple pottery. This variation suggests social stratification. Not rigid classes, perhaps, but a hierarchy of status visible in the afterlife as clearly as in the architecture of the living. The landscape itself becomes a patchwork of fortified strongholds. The lowlands host large population centres with broad ramparts and deep moats. The hills hold smaller but equally determined fortifications perched on defensible ridges. The Rift Valley contains settlements positioned near water sources, surrounded by walls thick enough to resist both attacks and seasonal environmental challenges. The plateau to the east maintains a network of fortified sites that protect herding communities and trade routes. The result is a region where travel between settlements would have been dominated by the sight of walls rising from plains, ridges, valleys, and basalt heights. One of the most fascinating puzzles of this era is how little we know about its rulers. Unlike later ages that left inscriptions carved in stone or letters written on clay tablets, the Middle Bronze Age in this region offers few written records. Names are scarce, titles are unclear. We do not know the lineages of the people who commanded the construction of walls or managed alliances, but the material evidence reveals societies organised enough to marshal labour on a grand scale, sophisticated enough to design complex defensive systems, and wealthy enough to support specialized armies. These are the marks of kings, even if their names remain lost. The organization of a labour itself is an archaeological clue. To build a glacis, hundreds of workers had to transport earth, shape slopes, and plaster surfaces repeatedly. Mud brick walls required mixing clay, forming bricks, drying them in the sun, and stacking them in systematic layers. Gate complexes demanded skilled masons. Craft districts needed trained artisans. All of this required leadership, whether through councils, chiefs, or early kings, and the ability to coordinate tasks across seasons. The architecture becomes a record of ancient logistics. As we move closer to the end of this era, signs of increasing regional interaction appear: pottery styles spread across large distances. Metal types become more uniform. Settlement patterns begin to shift, with some older centres declining while new ones rise. Environmental stress may have played a role, as climatic fluctuations altered agricultural output. Trade routes may have shifted, creating new economic hubs. But the overall impression is of a region deeply interconnected, defined by fortified centres whose influence reached well beyond their walls. By the time we reach the later centuries of the Middle Bronze Age, the landscape is unmistakably one of competing powers. Archaeologists find destruction layers at multiple sites, suggesting conflicts that reshaped political boundaries. Yet every rebuilding effort shows communities determined to remain in place, to reassert their presence through new walls and fresh foundations. This era is not defined by names, but by determination visible in mud brick and stone. What remains today are the bones of cities: thick ramparts, collapsed towers, eroded glacis, broken pottery, and silent tombs. But in those remains we see the rise of political complexity, the assertion of authority, and the creation of urban centres that would influence generations to come. The Middle Bronze Age turned this land into a landscape of kings, even if the kings themselves have vanished from memory. All we can say, with humility and the fragmentary evidence at hand, is that this was a time of ambition, a time when cities grew teeth, when walls replaced simple boundaries, when alliances knitted settlements together, and when the earliest forms of regional leadership reshaped the world in ways still visible today. You're watching a small community prepare to leave the land they have known for generations. They pack grinding stones into baskets, tie bundles of dried grain with reed rope, gather their herds, and look one last time at the hills, plains, or valleys that shaped their grandparents' stories. They are not being driven out by armies. No city behind them is burning. Yet they walk toward a distant river valley, hundreds of kilometres away. What force pulls entire families across deserts and narrow land bridges toward a place they have never seen? What if the answer lies not in conflict, but in the quiet persuasion of climate and opportunity? To understand why people from this region moved toward the eastern Nile delta between roughly 1,850 and 1,600 years before the present day, we must begin with climate. During these centuries, the eastern Mediterranean experienced fluctuations in rainfall and temperature that subtly but persistently reshaped life. Some years were generous, bringing winter rains that filled cisterns, nourished terraces, and supported herds. Other years brought dryness that crept slowly across fields, shortening growing seasons and reducing pastures. Archaeological sediments preserve these shifts, pollen sequences showing reduced cereal production, lake cores recording fluctuating water levels, and animal bone patterns indicating stress in local herds. These changes were not catastrophic. They were not dramatic enough to empty entire regions overnight. but they were enough to push some communities toward flexibility. Farmers living on the margins of arable land would have felt each cycle of drought more intensely. Pastoralists depending on seasonal grasses would have found their traditional routes narrower and less predictable. When environmental stress compounds gradually, people do not flee in panic. They begin to explore, to experiment, to send scouts or small family groups to test the possibilities of life elsewhere. In the archaeological record, such movement leaves faint traces. A few sherds of pottery styles appearing outside their typical zones, animal breeds shifting in composition, or settlement layers thinning as residents disperse. Alongside climate pressures came opportunity. The Nile Delta, with its vast marshlands, seasonal floods, and rich silt deposits, was one of the most stable agricultural environments in the ancient world. Even in dry years, the river's rhythm provided water and fertile soil. To communities accustomed to the uncertainties of Mediterranean rainfall, the delta offered something rare: predictability. Grain could be grown in abundance. Herds could graze on lush riverine vegetation. Fishing and reed gathering provided steady supplements to diet and income. For groups seeking economic security, the delta was a magnet. Archaeology shows that exchange between the eastern Mediterranean coast and the Nile Delta had existed long before this migration period. Coastal goods such as resins, timber, and certain pottery forms reached the delta through established trade routes. Similarly, goods from the Nile such as flax, papyrus, and specific types of faience found their way northward. These commercial ties created a corridor of familiarity. Traders who had previously visited the delta could report back on its opportunities. The presence of foreign goods in either region made the idea of movement less daunting. Over time, families began to join caravans heading south, not as traders alone, but as migrants searching for better prospects. Archaeological evidence for this movement appears most clearly in material culture. In certain settlements of the eastern delta, pottery styles emerge that blend local Egyptian techniques with Levantine shapes. Bowls with distinctive carinations, jars with specific handles, and cooking vessels made with coarse fabric reminiscent of northern traditions appear alongside local forms. These hybrid styles suggest not only the presence of migrants, but also their adaptation to new materials and new tastes. Some vessels were made by Levantine potters using local clay. Others were made by local potters imitating foreign styles. The result is a ceramic fingerprint of cultural blending, created without texts or explicit declarations, but through the everyday practice of cooking, storing, and sharing food. Other artifacts reinforce this picture. Scarabs and small amulets bearing iconography familiar to local Egyptian traditions appear in layers alongside tools, beads, and household objects typical of the Levant. The combination suggests households composed of people from both regions, living together, working together, and shaping a shared material world. Loom weights and spindle whorls show patterns of textile production that blend techniques from both sides of the corridor. Even dietary habits appear in the refuse pits. Fish remains from Nile marsh species mingle with bones of goats and sheep. More typical of the Levant settlement patterns in the delta, also reflect the presence of these newcomers. Excavations reveal neighbourhoods structured differently from older local designs. Some houses show ground plans more typical of northern villages, multi-room layouts with narrow storage areas, courtyards arranged in familiar patterns, and specific construction techniques such as mud brick bonding styles not native to the delta. These houses were not isolated. They formed clusters, suggesting that migrants settled in groups, reproducing aspects of their older communities while adapting them to new circumstances. It is important to emphasize that these movements were not mass migrations in the dramatic sense. They were cumulative, gradual and multi-generational. Some families likely moved temporarily, returning north with goods or news. Others may have settled permanently. Archaeology rarely shows sudden demographic replacement. Instead, it reveals something more human: mingling, adaptation, adjustment, and the quiet resilience of communities seeking stability. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is the emergence of hybrid cultural zones. In these spaces, objects do not fit neatly into categories labelled Levantine or Egyptian. Instead, they reflect shared workshops, intermarriage, or cooperative labour. Scholars sometimes describe this as a dialogue of material culture, where each group learned from the other. Pottery forms changed. Tools shifted, architectural styles blended. Even burial practices show signs of fusion, with some tombs combining Levantine grave goods with local burial structures. Climate patterns in the delta played a crucial role in sustaining these communities. The annual flooding of the Nile deposited nutrient-rich silt across fields, creating soil that required no ploughing. Water was abundant, allowing intensive agriculture without the dependence on unpredictable rainfall patterns. This stability must have seemed transformative to migrants from regions where drought could threaten entire harvests. The ability to produce surpluses and store grain effectively created new economic possibilities. Trade opportunities flourished as well. Migrants who maintained connections with their northern homelands could act as intermediaries, facilitating the flow of goods between regions. Archaeological finds suggest increased movement of copper, resins, oils, and textiles. During this period, coastal communities in the north would have valued items from the Nile, while the delta benefited from goods produced in the Levant. Migration thus strengthened trade networks, making the movement of people part of a larger web of exchange. Environmental data adds another dimension to this story. Sediment cores from lakes and marshes in the Levant show increasing aridity in certain centuries. Meanwhile, cores from the Nile Delta show relatively stable flood patterns. This environmental contrast made migration an adaptive strategy. Humans have always moved toward water, toward fertility, toward ecological reliability. The Delta offered these conditions in abundance. Despite this movement, it is important to remember that the Levant itself was not emptied. Many communities remained. Cities continued to grow, fortify, and innovate. Migration was selective, shaped by opportunity and need, not by collapse. Those who left joined a larger environment of cultural interaction, contributing their skills, traditions, and labour to new settings. Over time, the presence of Levantine migrants in the delta formed a layered archaeological signature. In some sites, the blend of cultures deepened. In others, the influence waned as migrants assimilated or returned home. Material culture ebbed and flowed, reflecting the dynamic human relationships behind it. What remains today are only fragments. A jar that looks northern but is made with delta clay. A house plan that echoes a distant homeland. A hearth where fish bones from the Nile lie beside goat bones brought by herders. We cannot reconstruct every detail of this landscape of movement. We do not know the individual stories of those who walked from village to delta marsh, but we can say, with humility, that climate and opportunity pulled people southward, not as conquerors or refugees in the dramatic sense, but as families searching for stable seasons, fertile soil, and a chance to shape new lives in a land fed by the rhythms of a great river. The archaeological record reveals a world defined by adaptation, blending, and practical choices. These migrants did not shape history through dramatic events. They shaped it through persistence, cooperation, and the quiet act of resettlement. Their legacy is found not in texts, but in the pottery they made, the homes they built, and the landscapes they embraced when the land they once knew offered less certainty than the water of the Nile. Within the landscape itself, the presence of Egyptian New Kingdom administration appears in more subtle ways. Roadways were improved to allow steady movement of officials and supplies. Frontier stations acted as checkpoints, regulating traffic along the coastal plain and across the inland routes. Archaeologists also note standardized weights and measures appearing across the region, suggesting an economic system tied to the expectations of the larger empire. Even scarabs, those small carved amulets, show up in far greater numbers, often found in domestic contexts. These were not royal symbols, but tokens of connection, exchanged through trade networks that reached deep into local economies. And yet, despite this extensive integration, the land did not lose its earlier complexity. Excavated houses remain distinctly local in layout. Foodways remain rooted in regional crops and livestock. Burial customs continue to reflect long-established traditions. The shift is not one of cultural erasure, but of entanglement, where local identity persists while adapting to an external framework of power. Archaeology is good at detecting entanglement because it shows up in contrasts: imported luxury goods beside locally made cooking pots, foreign administrative seals beside household figurines that look just like those from centuries before. Climate also played its role. The 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era were marked by relative environmental stability in this region, which allowed agriculture and trade to flourish. Surpluses encouraged long-distance exchange, and long-distance exchange encouraged imperial attention. Lush harvests in the lowlands, combined with fortified hill cities, created a mosaic of wealth and defensibility that made this region both attractive and challenging to administer. When rainfall rhythms were good, caravans moved freely. When they faltered, letters preserved on clay record urgent request for grain, suggesting how fragile stability could be when stretched across vast distances. To understand how ordinary people lived under this system, archaeologists look for the small clues: loom weights, spindle whirls, hearths, grinding stones, children's toys, and animal bones. Nothing about daily life suggests a population living in occupational crisis. Instead, it suggests a world where local households continued their rhythms while overhead. The alliances and demands of kings shaped taxation, labour obligations, and trade. When the influence of the Nile kingdom strengthened, caravans brought copper, gold, and fine linens into the region. When it weakened, city-states turned back toward old rivalries, defending their water sources, farmlands, and roads as they had for centuries. The most striking archaeological signature of this era is stability mixed with friction. Some cities grow richer than before, evidenced by large storerooms, imported ceramics, and multi-story buildings. Others experience destruction layers that show conflict between rival local rulers. These upheavals are not the result of modern borders or modern politics. They are the ordinary turbulence of Bronze Age city-states negotiating grain, water, loyalty, and power under the gaze of a distant imperial force. Eventually, this system would strain. Trade lines would weaken, letters would stop being answered, and garrisons would grow thin. But for several centuries the land was held within one of the earliest large-scale international systems in human history, and archaeology allows us to see how layered, negotiated, and complex that system was. Perhaps the quiet lesson left in the soil is this: even in the Bronze Age, no land shaped itself alone. Forces far away could redraw local maps, not with modern ideas of borders or nations, but with storage jars, accountants, soldiers, and scribes. And long after those distant kings faded, The walls, roads, and ceramic shards they left behind still sit under the sun, reminding us how deeply ancient the idea of interconnected worlds truly is. You wake in a hilltop settlement, the air still cool, the smell of hearth smoke drifting between stone terraces, and far to the south something new is moving. Not a rumour, not a story, but a system. A power so distant that you may never see its ruling city, yet its presence begins to shape the world beneath your feet. For the first time, the land between the sea and the Great Rift is being reorganized, not by its own cities, but by the ambitions of a river civilization hundreds of kilometers away. It is one of the earliest moments in history when geopolitical mechanics stretch beyond their own borders, reaching into foreign soil with administrators, scribes, and expectations, and archaeology, not memory, tells us how profoundly this changed the landscape. The reveal comes quietly. Long before later kingdoms and later narratives, the region we now call Canaan was folded into the sphere of the Egyptian New Kingdom, leaving a network of artifacts, trade goods, architecture, and letters that speak of a world adjusting to distant authority. These traces are unbiased. They sit in layers of earth, not on parchment. They tell us who sent grain where, who asked for military support, who rebelled, who negotiated, and who drifted into silence. They allow us to see a land that learned to navigate someone else's map. Archaeologists begin with the physical footprint. Over the course of these centuries, fortified city-states across the hills, plains and valleys show layers that point to revitalization. New gates, new bastions, renewed walls, recut storage pits, and imported ceramics arriving in steady supply. At several sites, large administrative buildings appear, their architectural style echoing forms found along the Nile. These structures were not just grand halls, they were logistical hubs, inventory rooms, and places where scribes recorded tribute, handled diplomatic correspondence, and coordinated shipments. Their presence suggests that local rulers were no longer operating entirely on their own terms. They were now embedded within a larger political network whose centre lay far beyond their horizon. The system emerges more clearly when archaeologists examine material culture. Everyday pottery, once strictly local, begins to include vessels shaped in styles characteristic of Nile workshops. Some are imports, carried north by caravans or ships. Others are local imitations produced by regional potters who had learned new shapes and firing techniques. These mixed assemblages show not cultural replacement but cultural layering, the kind that happens whenever long-distance administration and uninterrupted trade meet ajar is still ajar, but its curve, lip, and clay temper whisper where its inspiration came from. Settlement patterns also shift. Several towns known from earlier centuries grow into regional power centres under the influence of the Nile kingdom. Their locations were carefully chosen: access to water, defensible topography, and proximity to trade routes. Excavations reveal storage magazines capable of holding grain and oil far beyond the needs of local households, hinting at a taxation system that funneled resources toward the south. Yet these centres were not simple outposts. Their architecture shows hybrid influences, blending local stonework with distant building traditions. Even the arrangement of courtyards and offices follows a logic found in both worlds. Then there is the written evidence, a rare window into Bronze Age negotiation. At a site far to the south, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of clay tablets, their script showing requests, complaints, offerings, and alliances written by local rulers from across the Levant. Although these tablets were found outside the region we are exploring, They speak constantly of its towns, its trade, and its obligations. Their content is administrative, not mythic. They describe grain shortages, requests for archers, disputes over borderlands between city-states, and reminders to uphold agreements. These rulers write not as conquered subjects but as vassals navigating a delicate balance, loyal enough to keep favour, autonomous enough to handle their own local rivalries. Your eyes open just before dawn, not to an alarm or a screen, but to the sound of a clay jar settling against another one as the temperature changes. The air inside the room is cool, still touched by the night. The walls around you are thick mud brick covered with pale plaster, their surfaces faintly cracked like dry desert lake beds. Above you, a low ceiling of wooden beams and woven reeds holds back the sky. You're lying on a simple mat of goat hair and plant fibres, and when you sit up, the scent of yesterday's fire still lingers in the air. This is not a palace. It is an ordinary home inside a Bronze Age city. And archaeology tells us more about this moment than we might expect. The reveal begins quietly. Daily life in a city of this era was neither exotic nor primitive. It was structured, rhythmic, and surprisingly familiar, in the sense that most tasks began before the sun rose. Archaeologists often start with floor layers when they reconstruct domestic life, because floors act like diaries. They catch crumbs, broken beads, cracked spindle whorls, charred seeds, animal bones, ash, and the lost pieces of living. When a house collapsed or was abandoned, those layers became sealed chapters, and by reading them carefully we can reconstruct what someone might have done the moment they stepped into the new day. The first activity of the morning usually involved fire. Archaeological hearths from this period show carefully arranged clay-lined pits or circular stone rings where embers were banked under ash to keep them alive overnight. With a few blows, those embers could be revived into flame. Grinding stones nearby show that grain was often processed at dawn. A rhythmic back-and-forth motion of a handstone over a saddle quern, crushing emmer wheat into coarse flour. This flour became porridge or flatbread cooked on a ceramic griddle. Charred seeds and phytoliths recovered from these homes confirm a diet based on wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, and occasional wild foraged plants that still grew in patches around the settlement. Step outside with your imaginary morning meal, and you stand in a narrow lane paved with packed dirt and crushed limestone. Bronze Age cities in this region were tightly planned, and multi-layered excavations reveal clusters of houses grouped by kinship or craft, forming little micro-communities within the larger urban world. Each cluster often shared a courtyard, a cistern, or a small oven. The sounds of the day were unmistakable. Pounding grain, bleating goats, the clatter of pottery being moved, the rasp of bronze tools being sharpened against stone. The heart of many domestic compounds was the storage room. Archaeologists know this because the jars found there are huge, sometimes taller than a person's hip, sealed with mud stoppers and lined with resin to prevent seepage. These jars stored grain, oil, dried figs, wine, and water, each left behind its own chemical trace. Residue analysis has identified olive oil absorbed into the pores of ceramic walls and wine compounds binding to ancient clay. These storage spaces were not random. They marked stability, planning, and the ability to survive years when rainfall faltered or harvest dipped. If you walked deeper into a typical neighbourhood, you might find a workshop tucked between houses. Bronze Age cities were full of such spaces, dedicated to the crafts that define the era: pottery making, metalworking, textile production, and carpentry. Pottery workshops leave behind heaps of misfired vessels and the distinctive red-orange dust of local clay. the potter's wheel had reached this region by this time, allowing for faster production and more standardized shapes. Archaeologists identified these wheels not only by the vessels themselves, but by the circular pivot stones and the smooth plastered floors worn by generations of turning metalworking areas are even easier to spot. They contain slag, crucibles with vitrified interiors, and bronze scraps hammered into thin sheets. Bronze, that mixture of copper and tin, was precious. The fact that tin rarely occurs naturally in this region tells us something important. This city was connected to lands far away, through caravans, trading routes, and maritime links. When you pick up a bronze tool in a museum today, it often holds the fingerprint of a trade network that stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas. Textile production might be the most archaeologically visible craft of all. Nearly every excavation of this period uncovers spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, and bone spatulas used for beating weft threads into place. Clothing was most likely made from wool and linen. Sheep bones found in domestic waste piles tell us that flocks were managed carefully, and impressions of woven fabric sometimes survive on the surfaces of pottery where a cloth once rested before firing. In this sense, the daily world of textiles was as omnipresent then as the world of electronics is today. Every household had its tools. Every family made its own garments or traded them for grain, oil, or metal goods. Walk further and the architecture changes. Streets widen slightly. Buildings grow larger. You may find yourself before a public courtyard or a market space where goods were exchanged. Excavations reveal stone benches, broad thresholds, and large grinding installations indicating shared labour. Archaeologists even find animal bones with cut marks that suggest communal butchering, especially of goats and sheep. Such bones are often concentrated in specific areas, hinting at designated market spaces where people bought meat for festivals, trade, or household consumption. The sounds of the city also came from craftsmen who shaped stone into grinding slabs, carved wooden beams into doors and lintels, or baked bricks in simple kilns. Mud brick was the backbone of Bronze Age architecture, made by mixing clay, straw and water, then drying the bricks in the sun. Many walls were plastered to protect them from rain, and some were even whitewashed to keep interiors cool. When archaeologists excavate these sites, they find collapsed mud brick walls forming thick, sloping layers that preserve the outlines of entire buildings. Like a negative imprint of ancient streets, water was the defining factor of city life. Without a large river running through most of this region, cities depended on cisterns, springs, and careful management of rainfall. Archaeologists often find deep stone-lined shafts carved into bedrock, connected to channels that brought in runoff from roofs and streets. These cisterns were communal shields against drought, their preservation a matter of survival. The ability to store thousands of litres of water was part engineering, part social contract. It required the cooperation of families and leaders alike. What about the objects that reveal long-distance connections? These appear as flashes of colour in the archaeological record. A faience bead here, a fragment of imported pottery there, blue pigments derived from far-off sources, a tiny gold pendant hammered by someone whose hands never touched the soil of this land. These pieces arrived through trade networks that linked multiple Bronze Age realms. Their presence in homes suggests not lavish luxury, but the slow seep of global contact through merchants, scribes, envoys, and travellers who carried stories along with goods. Domestic spaces also reveal evidence of children. Small ceramic rattles, miniature pots, and tiny footprints preserved in ancient floors appear in several excavations. These traces remind us that the city was not merely an administrative grid or a military fort. It was a place where generations grew, where children learned to grind grain, shape clay, and herd goats through narrow lanes. And in the waste layers, archaeologists sometimes find animal bones arranged in patterns suggesting early games or simple toys. Step into the evening now. The sun dips behind the hills, cooling the plastered walls. Inside a home, light filters through the doorway and dances on the floor as someone stirs a pot of lentils or barley stew. Ceramic lamps burn olive oil, their wicks made from twisted plant fibres. The smell of cooking mingles with the faint metallic tang from the workshop next door. If you listen closely, you hear the clatter of tools being put away, the murmur of neighbours exchanging news, the bleating of animals returning to their pens. What did rest feel like in such a city? Archaeology cannot tell us everything, but it can tell us enough. Sleeping rooms were simple, equipped with mats, blankets, and storage bins. Roofs were flat, and in the warm season, families sometimes slept there under the sky. Life was not easy, but it was stable enough that people built multi-room houses, invested in storage, wove fine textiles, imported foreign jars, and rebuilt their homes generation after generation. When we step back from these details, the realization is humble. Daily life in a Bronze Age city was not defined by kings or scribes or distant empires. It was defined by hands grinding grain, shaping jars, stitching cloth, drawing water, and feeding children. The grand narratives of this period matter, but the archaeological record quietly reminds us that the real heartbeat of the city came from ordinary people whose names we will never know, and yet they left behind enough traces that, thousands of years later, we can still imagine waking in their homes, walking their streets, and feeling the ancient rhythm of a world that vanished but never fully disappeared from the soil. You stand on the high walls of a once prosperous Bronze Age city at dusk. The horizon is quiet, but something feels wrong. The storage jars in the courtyards below are only half-filled caravans that once arrived each week have not appeared in months. The wind that carries the smell of dry earth tells a story older than memory. Nothing visible is attacking the city, yet something is giving way. A system that took centuries to weave is beginning to loosen, strand by strand, almost too slowly for anyone inside it to notice. Archaeology allows us to see this unravelling with a clarity that those who lived through it never had. The reveal is subtle, but immense. The Bronze Age collapse in this region was not a single event. It was a convergence, a long, slow pressure from climate, trade, shifting populations, and fragile political relationships that were stretched farther than their world could support. If we remove later stories, later labels, later explanations, and look only at the soil, only at pollen grains, only at burned layers and broken walls, a different picture emerges, one without villains, one without triumph, one that shows a landscape simply buckling under stresses that no city-state could resist alone. Archaeologists begin with the climate, because the Earth recorded this story first, in pollen cores drilled from ancient lake beds and marshlands. There is a steady, unmistakable shift. Around these centuries, plant species that thrive in wetter conditions begin to decline. Drought-resistant shrubs and grasses rise in their place. This transition does not appear suddenly. It stretches across decades, tightening year by year tree pollen, especially from species that need deep, stable moisture, drops sharply. This suggests a long-term drying trend across the region. Not a single failed harvest, but many. Not a brief drought, but repeated years where rainfall came too little or too late. Drought alone does not topple civilizations, but drought in a world built on fragile interdependence is another matter. Bronze Age cities in this land relied heavily on exchange. grain from fertile valleys, copper from distant mountains, timber from coastal forests, oil and wine from terraced hills. When one part of the network faltered, another compensated. But when multiple regions experienced stress simultaneously, archaeology suggests they did, the entire system began to wobble. Storage jars, once brimming, began to empty faster than they were refilled. Then comes the evidence of abandonment. Across the land between the sea and the Great Rift, many settlements show clear signs of gradual depopulation during this period. Excavations reveal houses left standing but empty, pottery left in place, as if families simply walked away. In some towns, layers show a sudden burn, a violent episode that sealed floors and preserved entire rooms beneath charred debris. In others, there is no burn at all, just silence, as if the last residents locked their doors behind them and never returned. Archaeologists can distinguish these two endings. Destruction speaks of crisis, quiet abandonment suggests exhaustion. The soil also preserves the story of trade breaking down. Imported pottery styles that once arrived regularly from Cyprus, Mesopotamia, Anatolia and the Nile begin to diminish. The once steady flow of tin, without which bronze cannot be made, slows dramatically. Old routes that caravans travelled for centuries grow dangerous or simply impractical. Archaeologists find fewer foreign seals, fewer weights used for long-distance commerce, fewer luxury goods, and the local pottery begins to change. Forms simplify, decorations decline, and standardization weakens. These are the fingerprints of a shrinking world. Water systems too begin to show strain. Cisterns that once held enough rainfall to last months became inadequate when the rain stopped coming on scheduled channels built to guide winter runoff dried earlier than expected. Archaeologists studying sediment layers in these systems note increased silt and debris, signs of flash floods rather than steady seasonal rains. A world accustomed to predictable patterns was suddenly forced to adapt to chaos. Another clue lies in the bones, both human and animal. Animal remains in the final layers of late Bronze Age cities show a shift in herd composition. Fewer cattle, more goats and sheep. Cattle require stable grazing and abundant water. Goats can survive on scrub. When archaeologists see goats rising sharply in percentages, they know the land was under stress. Human dietary isotopes from this era echo the same story. Diets grew less varied, leaning more heavily on hardy grains, suggesting fewer options and more rationing. These are the intimate signs of people coping with scarcity. Archaeology also reveals a shift in architecture. In earlier centuries, city walls grew larger, stronger, more confident. But in the decades leading to the collapse, some towns stop renewing their defences. Ramparts crumble and are not repaired. Towers remain half rebuilt. Public buildings show signs of neglect. This is not because threats vanished, but because resources did. A fortified wall is a promise about the future. When a community no longer believes it can uphold that promise, the wall is allowed to decay. We can also see the collapse in the small things. A potter's workshop that once produced hundreds of vessels now shows only a few unfinished pieces. A metalworking area that once smelted copper ingots now contains only scraps. A marketplace that once bustled with imported goods becomes a cluster of small household stalls. Archaeological layers do not lie. They reveal a shrinking economy, a contraction of networks, a simplification of life. In some places, destruction layers appear abruptly. Thick ash, fallen mud bricks, charred wooden beams, and smashed pottery tell of sudden violence. But archaeology cannot always say who caused these fires. What it can say is that they often came after long decline, not at the height of prosperity. These were cities already weakened, already strained, already vulnerable to any shock, whether internal conflict, opportunistic raids, or accidental catastrophes. No single enemy is visible, because the collapse was not a war, it was a system failure. The story becomes even clearer when archaeologists map the sequence of collapses. The earliest failures occur not in the richest or most powerful cities, but in those most dependent on fragile networks. Cities in arid zones fall first, their water sources too precarious to sustain long drought. Then lowland towns that relied heavily on imported goods weaken. Finally, even prosperous regions in the hill country lose their ability to maintain their earlier complexity. The pattern spreads like a slow tide, not a sudden tidal wave. One of the most striking signatures of this time is the disappearance of writing. Clay tablets, administrative seals, and inscribed objects become rare. This does not mean literacy ended entirely, but that the bureaucratic machinery supporting it collapsed. A world that once recorded negotiations, shipments, marriages, and agreements simply stopped writing things down. The silence of the written record is one of the clearest indicators that the old system had dissolved. For ordinary people, life likely changed gradually, not instantly. Archaeology shows that some communities adapted successfully. They shifted toward mixed herding and farming, relied more on local materials, and moved away from large-scale urbanity. These small rural villages, often invisible in earlier centuries, become more common in the archaeological record after the collapse. They suggest resilience, not disappearance. A system can fall apart without its people vanishing. The resolution this era offers is not dramatic. It is quiet truth. Civilizations do not always end in flames. Sometimes they fade because the climate shifts by a few degrees, because a river changes course, because trade routes hollow out, because the world they depended on stops holding them. The Bronze Age collapse in this region was a moment when complexity outgrew stability, when a global system became too tightly interwoven to survive multiple simultaneous stresses, when cities that had thrived for centuries finally reached the limits of what their landscape, climate, and connections could support. What remains in the soil is a reminder that no stretch of history is guaranteed. Even the most advanced Bronze Age cities, rich in craft, trade, architecture, and diplomacy, were vulnerable to changes they could not foresee. And in the layers above the collapse, archaeologists find simpler homes, new pottery styles, different farming tools. Life continued, but differently. The world had shifted. The land remembers all of this without judgment. Burn layers, drought signatures, abandoned rooms, interrupted trade. They speak of people doing their best in a moment when the horizon grew uncertain. They remind us that complexity is not invincibility, and that sometimes a civilization ends not because someone conquered it, but because the world around it changed and it could not change fast enough. You walk through a landscape where silence has become the most common form of witness. Fields that once shimmered with wheat lie pale and brittle. The shells of abandoned towns sit on their tells, their walls slumped like tired shoulders. The great networks of exchange that once tied this land to mountains, islands, and distant river kingdoms have gone quiet. And yet, in that hush, something begins to move again. Footsteps, hearth smoke, the ring of pottery being shaped in new forms. A different kind of world is taking shape, not in the halls of kings, but in small clusters of homes, in newly ploughed terraces, in the colours of fresh ceramics turning in the sun. Archaeology teaches us that after collapse, landscapes do not remain empty for long, they become invitations. The reveal comes slowly. The centuries after the Bronze Age collapse were not a void but a reassembly. a mosaic forming from fragments, migrations, survivors, and innovations. This period marks the archaeological birth of what we later call the Iron Age, a time when new technologies, new settlement patterns, and new cultural signatures appeared across the land. Not as sweeping conquests, not as sudden invasions, but as layers of material evidence, pottery styles with unfamiliar spirals, houses built with different proportions, hearths arranged in patterns never seen before, tools forged through new metallurgical practices. Each discovery hints at a world reconnecting, reinventing itself from the quiet ground upward. Archaeologists begin this chapter with ceramics, because pottery is both fragile and eternal. Across the coastal plain and lowland sites, a new kind of ware appears in the layers dated to these centuries. Its shaped and painted motifs echo traditions from across the Aegean, yet they are not perfect copies. The clay is local. The firing temperatures fit regional kilns. The motifs are blended. These vessels likely reflect communities who carried influences from afar but lived and worked here, merging two worlds into one. Some of these coastal settlements show architecture that differs from the older Bronze Age cities. Houses arranged in clusters rather than dense urban blocks, courtyards oriented toward the sea, and storage installations built for mixed economies of farming, fishing, and trade. Move inland, and the picture shifts. The abandoned highlands, left behind during the climatic and political stress of the collapse, begin to fill again. Archaeologists uncover hundreds of small hill country sites from this era. They are not fortified, they are not cities. They are simple villages, often built on ridgelines or slopes that provide access to springs and terraced land. These terraces, cut carefully into the hills, reveal a population refocusing on local agriculture. Barley, lentils, figs, olives. The homes are often built in a distinctive rectangle, divided into long, narrow rooms that served as domestic, storage, and animal-keeping spaces. Archaeologists call these pillared houses, but that name comes from architecture, not identity. These dwellings reflect a social world based on family clusters, modest herding, and carefully managed fields. In these highland villages, the pottery tells a different story than the coast. It is simple, undecorated, utilitarian. Bowls with thick rims, jars with loop handles, cooking pots blackened by repeated use. This simplicity does not reflect cultural inferiority but economic focus. When life centers on sustenance rather than display, decoration becomes less important than function. Archaeologists studying where patterns see evidence of heavy grain processing, oil storage, and domestic cooking. These were communities building stability from the ground up. Water systems also reflect this return. Excavations reveal small rock-cut cisterns designed to store winter rains, often accompanied by plastered basins or channels that guided runoff from rooftops. These installations tell us that people in this era understood the fragility of rainfall patterns and adapted by building local solutions rather than depending on large centralized infrastructures. Unlike the massive Bronze Age cisterns that supported dense cities, these Iron Age predecessors were intimate, often maintained by individual households or extended families. In the lowlands, coastal settlements show evidence of mixed craft production. Some homes contain loom weights and spindles, suggesting textile work. Others hold specialized pottery kilns or metalworking debris. Metallurgy itself begins to shift. Iron objects appear in small but increasing numbers. At first, iron tools were rare and of variable quality, reflecting the difficulty of working with a metal that requires higher temperatures and more controlled processes than bronze. Yet the presence of iron blades, chisels, and ornaments in these layers indicates experimentation and gradual mastery. What makes this period archaeologically rich are the hybrid forms. At some sites, pottery combines inland shapes with coastal decorations. At others, stone architecture uses Bronze Age building traditions, but arranges spaces in new patterns. Storage jars from different regions appear together in middens, suggesting revived trade routes, likely smaller scale and less centralised than before, but persistent. This is what collapse often produces: a decentralised network of small communities, each adapting in their own way. Archaeologists also uncover evidence of diet changes. Animal bones from this era show a renewed emphasis on herding, particularly of goats and sheep. These animals thrive in rugged landscapes and can withstand irregular rainfall better than cattle. Yet, at some coastal sites, fish bones and shells appear in large quantities, signalling communities oriented toward the sea. Inland, isotopic analysis of human remains indicates a diet rich in cereal grains and supplemented by legumes and foraged plants. This diversity reflects a land of varied ecological strategies rather than a monolithic culture. One of the clearest markers of this period is the resettlement of formerly empty highlands. These hilltop villages often contain silos dug into bedrock, large enough to store grain for an entire season. The placement of such silos at the centre of family compounds suggests cooperative storage or shared responsibility among kin groups. Settlement spacing hints at a mosaic of small independent hamlets rather than a highly centralised polity. Yet the geographic distribution is deliberate. Nearly every village sits near a spring or natural water catchment. Archaeology sees in this a sophisticated understanding of resource mapping. Meanwhile, the coast undergoes its own transformation. Some settlements show influences from maritime cultures: oval-shaped hearths, cooking jugs with pierced handles, large granaries built with a different spatial logic than the Bronze Age grain stores. This does not indicate a unified group arriving from elsewhere, but rather a blend of seafaring traditions with local ones. The sea had always been a highway of ideas, and after the collapse it carried people looking for stability, opportunity, or simply new soil to plant themselves in. The landscape between coast and highlands tells a third story. In the valleys and low plains, archaeologists find evidence of renewed agriculture: plough marks etched into ancient topsoil, stone walls marking field boundaries, and animal pens built from reused mud bricks. The presence of iron sickles, even in small numbers, indicates the beginning of a technological shift that would eventually reshape farming efficiencies. Yet bronze tools remain dominant during this era, a reminder that transitions in the ancient world were slow, layered, and rarely absolute. Archaeology also reveals new forms of community organisation. In some inland regions, clusters of villages seem to coordinate storage or seasonal herding, based on the distribution of animal enclosures and shared paths. This suggests a regional network of cooperation, likely based on kinship ties or reciprocal labour. On the coast, larger settlements with mixed pottery and craft remains hint at more cosmopolitan communities, where people from different backgrounds interacted. Across all these landscapes, a unifying thread appears. People are rebuilding. They're choosing sites with reliable water, reclaiming terraces, shaping new pottery traditions, and forging metal in small workshops. The emptiness left by the collapse did not remain empty long. Cultures emerged not from grand narratives, but from everyday choices made by families, craftsmen, farmers, and herders. Perhaps the most revealing insight from archaeology is this: the Iron Age identities that later texts describe did not appear all at once. They emerged slowly through pottery shapes, house plans, storage technologies, metallurgy, and environmental strategies. Identity in this age is material before it is historical. A style of cooking pot might tell us more about a community's origins than any narrative written centuries later. The resolution this period offers is neither triumph nor tragedy, it is resilience. In the wake of systemic collapse, this land did not fragment into chaos, it reorganized. It became a patchwork of small, self-sufficient communities shaped by local needs and distant influences. The people who lived here did not know they were part of a new age. They were simply surviving, rebuilding, adapting. And in their clay, stone, fibre and ash, they left behind the earliest archaeological outlines of a world that would later be recognised as the beginning of the Iron Age. You are standing on a headland overlooking sea that has carried travellers for thousands of years. To your left lies a bustling port city where shipbuilders carve cedar into long, narrow hulls. To your right, far inland across the hills, small highland towns send shepherds toward the morning pastures. And somewhere even farther east, in the dusty corridors of caravan routes, scribes write in evolving alphabets shaped by hands that never touch the sea. This is the world that rises after the collapse and renewal of earlier centuries. The land once loosely gathered under the name Canaan now becomes something else entirely, not a single identity, not one people, not one story, but many. The reveal begins when archaeologists examine the layers dated to these centuries. The pottery suddenly changes shape, colour, decoration. The script shift from pictorial forms to linear letters. Urban centres along the coast flourish into nodes of Mediterranean trade, while inland villages consolidate into larger political units. Languages diversify in inscriptions left on stone, pottery, seals and metal. Even the architecture fragments into regional styles. The ancient name that once marked this land begins to blur in the archaeological record as new cultural signatures rise in its place. Archaeologists often start with the coast, because the sea leaves clues. By around 1,000 years before the Common Era, the shoreline cities of this region become some of the busiest ports in the ancient world. Excavations reveal shipwrecks, harbour installations, warehouses and workshops filled with anchors, fine pottery, metal goods, and timber cedar logs stacked for export still bear the chisel marks of Bronze Age woodworking traditions. But the scale of activity grows dramatically. These communities develop advanced shipbuilding techniques, using mortise and tenon joints, and layered planking that allow long-distance voyages across the Mediterranean. The influence of these maritime states radiates outward. Their goods reach North Africa, the Aegean, and even beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Their writing system becomes one of their most significant contributions to the world. A simple alphabetic script carved into stone and inked onto pottery sherds begins to appear across coastal sites. This script, with its compact forms and efficient structure, spreads far beyond the land of its origin. Archaeology traces its movement through seals, ink pots, and ostraca found in trade stations and port towns. Its simplicity allows it to be adopted and adapted by neighbouring cultures, eventually transforming the way language is recorded across continents. But in these early centuries, the script is simply the practical tool of merchants, traders, and administrators navigating a world where mobility matters move inland, and the picture becomes more intricate. In the highlands, small villages of the earlier Iron Age begin to grow into fortified towns. Archaeologists uncover watchtowers, defensive walls, and administrative buildings that signal increasing organisation and complexity. Storage silos expand, pottery production becomes more standardised. Some settlements evolve into regional centres, where craft production, trade, and agricultural management come together. Yet these inland centres look nothing like the coastal cities. Their material culture reflects a land-focused economy, terraced agriculture, mixed herding, local pottery styles and iron tools designed for cultivation and building rather than maritime trade. Scripts evolve here as well, though not always the same ones used on the coast. Inscriptions found in these inland regions show early forms of alphabetic writing influenced by neighbouring cultures from the north and northeast. These inscriptions appear on pottery, limestone fragments, and occasionally on monumental stones marking boundaries or commemorating officials. They reflect emerging administrative systems and growing political complexity, but they do not reveal unified identity. Instead, they demonstrate how multiple linguistic traditions coexisted and developed. Further east, in the valleys and plateaus, archaeological layers reveal a different story. These regions see the rise of city-states whose inscriptions and pottery styles reflect strong connections with the cultures of the northern Levant and the Syrian highlands. Their domestic architecture often includes large courtyard houses, multi-storey rooms, and administrative archives. Many of these sites produce inscriptions written in the Aramaic language and script, which gradually becomes a lingua franca across much of the Near East due to its practicality and widespread use by merchants and diplomats. But in these centuries, it is simply one regional tradition among many, reflecting a cultural world tied to caravan routes and overland trade rather than the sea. The southern regions offer yet another pattern. In the wake of earlier highland settlement expansion, several towns consolidate and develop small-scale political structures. Archaeologists identify public buildings, storehouses, and specialised workshops. Iron tools become more common, and the remains of a large-scale olive oil and wine production appear. Pottery forms continue to evolve. Cooking pots adopt new shapes suited to slow heating. Storage jars grow larger. Fineware vessels develop regional decorations that vary from valley to valley. These distinctions reflect not ethnicity, but localized traditions shaped by geography, subsistence strategies, and the availability of materials. Archaeology also shows clear evidence of cultural blending during these centuries. In some regions, imported coastal ceramics appear alongside inland handmade forms. In others, seals carved with iconography from the great empires to the north or south show up in modest households. Metal objects, especially iron knives, arrowheads, and agricultural tools, exhibit hybrid casting techniques. In one region, the influence of desert nomads becomes visible in animal husbandry patterns, tent ring foundations, and burial customs. In another, cedar wood from the coast appears in inland temples, indicating renewed long-distance exchange. The diversity of these layers forces archaeologists to recognize that this land no longer behaved as a single cultural unit after the collapse. Instead, it became a mosaic, a place where seafarers carved their identity into cedar ships, where inland farmers shaped their world through terraces and storage silos, where merchants carried scripts and goods across mountains, where pastoralists moved seasonally with herds, and where small towns forged political systems suited to their own landscapes. Another crucial indicator of fragmentation is the urban map. By the 10th century before the Common Era, the dominant cities of earlier millennia no longer hold exclusive power. New centres rise, coastal ports that thrive on trade, highland cities that control agricultural hinterlands, valley towns that serve as hubs for overland caravans. Excavations reveal shifting political boundaries, fortified lines, and networks of roads linking these centres. Each region organises itself differently, reflecting not a unified state, but a series of parallel cultural developments. This century also marks significant technological transitions. Iron, once rare and difficult to produce, becomes more widespread. Its availability transforms agriculture and warfare, but archaeology shows that iron adoption varied widely across regions. Some coastal workshops mastered iron early, leaving behind slag, tuyères and specialised furnaces. Inland villages often continue to use bronze tools alongside iron, a sign of gradual uneven transition rather than a sudden technological revolution. Script evolution mirrors this fragmentation. The alphabet used in coastal cities spreads outward, but inland regions adapt versions suited to their linguistic needs. The Aramaic script gains prominence in the north and east, representing bureaucratic expansion rather than cultural dominance. Some small valleys produce inscriptions in local variants that never spread widely. The result is a layered textual landscape, where multiple writing systems coexist, a rare archaeological window into a period before standardization took hold across the Near East. Religious practices also show regional variety. Archaeologists uncover open-air sanctuaries on coastal headlands, rock-cut shrines in the highlands, and small household altars in village homes. Figurines vary in style and iconography from region to region. Large temples with monumental columns appear in some cities, while other areas rely on small-scale community cultic installations. None of these indicate national religions. They reflect local traditions shaped by environment, contact, and craft. Even burial customs fragment coastal cemeteries, contain stone-built chambers and imported goods. Highland burials emphasize family clusters and domestic settings. Valley tombs include offerings tied to caravan trade. These distinctions remind us that identity in the ancient world was expressed through material practices, not through the political or ethnic categories we project backward. The resolution of this period lies in recognizing the emergence of multiplicity. By 600 years before the Common Era, the land once called Canaan in earlier writings no longer exists as a coherent cultural unit. Instead, it is a tapestry of Iron Age societies, seafarers, farmers, traders, pastoralists, scribes, and craftsmen. Each group leaves its own imprint on pottery, architecture, writing, and settlement patterns. None of these ancient identities map onto modern ones. They are archaeological signatures, fixed in time, shaped by their own circumstances, and separated from us by millennia of change. What archaeology shows most clearly is this: the name Canaan dissolves not through conquest, but through the natural evolution of cultures adapting to new economic realities, new technologies, new connections, and new landscapes. A land that once held many city-states under a broad label becomes a land where many cultures coexist without needing a single overarching identity. And in the layers they left behind, sherds, inscriptions, terraces, walls, we can still see their variety, preserved not in story, but in soil. Imagine this. You kneel beside a fragment of pottery half hidden in the dust, its surface faded by thousands of summers, and for a moment you feel the strange sensation that the person who held it is not gone at all. You cannot see their face, or know their language, or map their world to any modern identity, but the texture of the clay carries a warmth that once passed through human hands. It is the quietest form of survival, one that does not depend on memory, but on matter itself. And in this land, where every hill reveals another layer of living and leaving, the past seems less like something that happened long ago, and more like something that is still breathing beneath the soil. The reveal is simple. Archaeology does not remember people by names. It remembers them by choices. The curve of a vessel, the angle of a terrace wall, the way a path winds up through limestone where feet once learned the most efficient route. These are not the traces of kingdoms or nations or claims. They are the marks of living. When the late Bronze Age city collapsed into ash, when new settlers built small homesteads on high ridges, when ports rose along the coast and scripts multiplied across tablets and stones, each layer became part of a long, unbroken conversation between humans and the landscape. And even if those who shaped these places vanish from written history, the land itself refuses to forget the texture of their presence. Archaeologically speaking, what echoes is not bloodline, but pattern. Terraces carved on a hillside 5,000 years ago still guide the way water flows after a winter rain. A gateway rebuilt across different eras retains the same orientation because the topography gives no better alternative. Place names shift slowly, carrying shadows of older syllables, the way a river might carry the taste of earlier sediments long after the flood has passed. You could stand at the edge of a valley today and still follow the same lines of sight that guided farmers in the early Iron Age toward their fields and cisterns. Geography does not change as quickly as human identity, and so it becomes the keeper of stories that outlast language. What archaeology shows us is that most peoples do not vanish through erasure. They dissolve into continuity. Cultures blend, adopt, borrow, innovate, fragment, and recombine across centuries until their beginnings become impossible to pass. A cooking pot from one century mirrors the shape of another 2 centuries later, even though the people who made them would not have recognized each other as kin. A coastal workshop refines a technique learned from distant sailors. An inland family reshapes their house to store more grain during a drought. These are not the signatures of a single people, but of many hands learning from the same terrain. The echo persists not because a single story endured, but because a landscape kept teaching generations how to survive. Walk through the ruins of an Iron Age hilltop town, and you'll notice that the silence feels strangely full. The houses you see, or what remains of them, once framed the routines of people whose names are lost, but whose habits survive in the archaeological record. Grinding stones smoothed by years of grain preparation, loom weights scattered in corners where textiles were woven, animal bones arranged in patterns that reveal diet and seasonality. These remnants do not tell us who they were in terms of identity. They tell us who they were in terms of daily life. The difference is vast and humbling. Without text, without myth, without political narrative, what remains is simply the trace of existence itself. And this is perhaps the quiet truth that archaeology whispers more honestly than any chronicle. A people is not defined by what later histories call them, nor by which modern groups attempt to claim them. A people is defined by how they shaped their environment, how they adapted to their climate, how they crafted tools from the materials available to them, and how their choices became part of the sediment accumulating beneath our feet. The further back we look, the more humanity dissolves into patterns rather than boundaries. The Bronze Age towns, the Middle Bronze fortresses, the early Iron Age villages, the shifting scripts and ceramic styles, all of them speak of relationships, adaptations, and shared landscapes, not of ownership or inheritance. The reflective question that emerges is not who were they in the modern sense, but rather what did they leave behind that still moves through us? And the answer, unexpectedly, is scale. They remind us that cultures are temporary but landscapes are patient, that identities evolve but survival strategies endure, that the earth beneath us contains more human stories than any genealogy could ever hold. A path, once carved, invites new footsteps. A water source, once discovered, draws new communities. A harbour, once built, becomes a magnet for trade long after the original builders disappear. Continuity does not require memory. It only requires usefulness. Imagine the hills again, not as borders or territories, but as amphitheatres of time. Every terrace, every stone wall, every fragment of amphora, every faint inscription is a note in a wider composition that has been unfolding since the first hominin footsteps entered this corridor of earth. When the scripts of the early Iron Age began to proliferate, each letter was anchored to older symbols carved centuries before. When small coastal states developed maritime networks, they sailed along routes that Neolithic fishers had already learned to read. When inland towns reorganized their houses and silos, they were responding to environmental rhythms set in motion long before any culture was named. If there is something moving about their story, it is that none of it anticipates us. These ancient communities did not imagine themselves as ancestors of anyone in particular. They built for the needs of their own horizon, a dependable water supply, a secure storage room, a path that would not collapse under heavy rain. And yet those choices, made without any thought of legacy, became the archaeological signatures we now read as if decoding a lost language. This is the irony of deep time. The most enduring traces are rarely the ones meant to last. If you sit quietly long enough beside a ruin, you start to sense a kind of geological compassion in the way stone absorbs identity without judgment. A broken wall does not distinguish between the hands that built it and the hands that rebuilt it. A shard of pottery does not preserve lineage, only function, and the land itself does not divide its ancient inhabitants into categories. It records them as layers, each one altering the next. This is why archaeology is both humbling and comforting. It reminds us that the ground beneath us is not neutral. It is full of the residue of countless lives that once did all the ordinary things we do now: cook, store food, build homes, raise children, adapt to climate, negotiate with neighbours, bury their dead, and leave. What echoes across time is not identity, but presence. The presence of people who listen to the same wind moving through the same valleys, who watch the same seasonal shifts across the same ridgelines, who made choices shaped by the same ecological truths that still operate today. Their story is stitched into the land not because they were chosen or exceptional, but because they were here long enough to leave an imprint that even erosion could not erase. And when you look at it this way, the idea of inheritance changes. The past does not belong to any modern group, it belongs to time itself. Every ancient population that lived in this corridor of earth contributed something to the evolving mosaic of culture, technology, and adaptation. Their influence persists not through direct descent but through the persistence of places they once shaped. A terrace that stabilizes a hillside, a road that curves along a natural contour, a port that still makes sense for trade because geography has not changed. These are the echoes that matter. So when we say that their story still resonates, it is not because they left us names, it is because they left us forms, patterns of human response to landscape, climate, opportunity, and necessity. Their story lives not as a single thread, but as a sedimentary record of lives layered atop one another, each leaving behind something small but tangible, a shape, a method, a pathway, a rhythm. And as we come to the quiet close of this long chronicle, we return to one simple truth. The ancient peoples of this land do not survive through inheritance or identity. They survive through geology, through the stones that still hold the warmth of hands long gone, through the landscape that carries the memory of every footprint pressed into its dust. Their story ends not in inheritance, but in geology. A reminder that the oldest claim any people have is simply that they lived, and left something worth finding.